Chapter 1. Behavior Modification. Rochester nudged my knee as I was trying to write a press release. "What's the matter, boy? You need to go out?" I looked down at the golden retriever by my side, but instead of jumping up, he flopped down and rolled on his back, wagging his paws in the air like a stranded beetle. "I don't have time to play. I have work to do. Somebody has to pay for your kibbles and bits." That was the wrong thing to say. Rochester immediately hopped up and looked at me with big brown eyes. "Fine, one treat, then you go lay down." He shook his head again, but I handed him the treat anyway. I kept a vacuum-sealed jar on my office desk, filled with tiny treats in the shape of T-bone steaks. He gobbled the tidbit, then trotted across the room, where he sprawled in front of the French doors and rested his head on his paws, staring at me. We were both new at this full-time job business. When Rochester first came to live with me, I was working as an adjunct in the English department at Eastern College, my alma mater, and struggling to develop a freelance writing business. Rochester had gotten accustomed to hanging around me, and I'd come to appreciate his presence. When I was offered this job, I agreed to take it only if I could bring him with me to work. He may be a golden retriever, but I think of him as a Velcro dog. He likes to stick to me. Maybe it's because his first owner, my next-door neighbor, was murdered, and he's afraid that I might leave him too. Mike McCormick, the director of alumni relations, agreed to my request because he was a dog lover himself, and because it wasn't easy to find someone with my unique combination of writing skills and computer ability who was willing to work short-term for a not-quite-so-generous salary and some reasonable health benefits. In 2 days, Eastern was going to launch a $500 million capital campaign to fund new construction, scholarships, and faculty chairs. Though my public relations job was only temporary, for the winter term, I was hoping to move into a permanent position with the campaign if Mike liked my work. As I was finishing the press release, Mike stuck his head in my office door, holding a cup of coffee. "Hey, Steve, did you get back the proofs for the program yet?" Mike typified the no-neck monster stereotype of college athletes. He was thick-set and muscular, with dark hair and a heavy 5 o'clock shadow, even early in the morning. At 35, he was 7 years younger than I was, though shorter and stockier. "Just came in from the printer," I said. "They misspelled President Babson's name, but I already called and had them corrected." On his way to my desk, he stopped to scratch behind Rochester's ears. "My Rottweilers would eat you up, Rochester," he said. "You're too sweet." I was jealous to see Rochester look up at him with doggy adoration, but I knew that the moment I called the dog to me, he'd be all over me, slobbering on my slacks, shedding on my chair, and keeping me from getting any work done. I watched Mike read the page proofs, waiting for him to reach the section on the keynote speaker. He lifted the cup to his lips, and I said, "Don't!" He looked up at me, then back down at the page proofs, then burst into laughter. "Keynote speaker, President John William Baboon?" He laughed so hard that the coffee in his cup threatened to spill over as his hand shook. "Thought you wanted to see them misspell Babson yourself," I said. "I couldn't let you get some coffee in your mouth, though." "Appreciate that." Mike had been a football star at Eastern, then assistant coach, then director of athletics. He had only been the chief fundraiser for a year or two, and I knew he was depending on the success of the fundraising campaign to keep his job. I had a lot at stake, too. I needed a permanent gig, if only to keep a roof over my head and Rochester's, and food on my table and in his bowl. Mike returned the page proofs to my desk. "I need a favor. Can you run down to the printers and pick these up? We're going to need them at 4 to start stuffing packets. We're setting up an assembly line in the ballroom." Each guest was to receive a folder with information on Eastern and the capital campaign. I had written a series of flyers on critical areas in need of funding, the science labs, the music building, and so on. Every guest would receive a no-skid pad for the back of a cell phone, embossed with the Eastern logo, along with contribution forms and a host of other materials. "Sure, I'll head down there around 3:30 and pick them up." He stopped by the door on his way out. "With winter break, this place is pretty empty, but I've rounded up every kid I could find and commandeered every staff member who didn't have a good excuse. I even got campus security roped in." Mike's mention of campus security reminded me of my own past with law enforcement, as so many things did. I served a short prison sentence in California for computer hacking, which led in no small part to the failure of my marriage. When I was discharged on parole, I returned to my hometown, Stewart's Crossing, just down the Delaware River from Eastern. I moved into a townhouse my late father had left for me and met my next-door neighbor, Carolyn Kelly, and her golden retriever, Rochester. She was killed while walking Rochester, and my high school friend Rick Stemper was the investigating detective in her case. As a favor, I agreed to take care of Rochester for a few days after her death. He quickly won me over, and he and I helped the police figure out who killed Carolyn. My ex-wife and I had tried twice to have a child, but she miscarried both times. A psychologist might have said that I was replacing those two lost children with Rochester, but all I knew was that I liked having the big goofy guy around. After I checked my press release one more time, then emailed it to my list of media contacts, I walked over to where Rochester dozed and sat down cross-legged next to him. He leaned up and put his big golden head in my lap. I scratched under his chin and behind his ears, and he wiggled around and stretched his legs. "Who's a good boy?" I asked, leaning down to bury my head in the soft fur of his neck. "Who's Daddy's good boy?" He sat up and put his front paws on my shoulders, licking my face as I laughed and tried to wiggle away. "Hate to interrupt your love fest, but we need to talk about Bob Moran." I looked up and saw Mike in my doorway again, accompanied by Sally Marston, the assistant director of admissions. Sorry, I said, jumping up in embarrassment. "Just taking a puppy break. What can I do for you?" Mike and Sally came in and sat down across from my desk. She was a slim 24-year-old, the kind of girl who looked like she had played field hockey in high school and college. Her normal attire was a Fair Isle sweater and a kilt with a big safety pin in the side. "Bob Moran is a wealthy alum I have targeted for a major gift for the campaign," Mike said. "He's a continuous giver with a strong connection to Eastern." He looked over at Sally. "He also has a 17-year-old son who applied for early decision," she said. "A legacy kid like Marty who has a decent background gets right in, but his SAT scores are way down on the chart. And he's barely breaking a C average at his prep school. So Joe turned him down for early decision and moved him into the regular applicant pool, where he has even less chance of getting in." Joe DeGorian was the director of admissions, Sally's boss. "There's the problem," Mike said. "Joe refuses to admit Marty, which is going to kill any chance we have of getting a gift from his father." "You have to understand Joe's position," Sally said. "I've met Marty. He's sullen and uncommunicative, and there may be even something wrong with him mentally. He just doesn't belong here." "But his father is determined that he go here," Mike said. "He even offered to make a $100,000 donation to kick off the capital campaign if Marty gets an acceptance letter." He turned to Sally. "Can you do an end run around him and send out the acceptance letter yourself?" "You know I can't do that," Sally said. "He's my boss. I'd lose my job." "Is Moran on your RSVP list for the party?" Mike asked me. I flipped through the list. "Yup." "Well, it would be great if we could announce that $100,000 gift." He looked at me. "You have a good relationship with Joe, Steve. Can you talk to him?" That was not something I wanted to do, but Mike was my boss. "Sure, I'll go look for him right now." I gave Rochester a treat and told him to stay put and walked down the hall to Joe's office. Joe was, in large part, the reason I'd gone to Eastern. When I was a high school senior years before, and he was the director of admissions, he had convinced me to come to Eastern over the other schools where I could have gone. I had always appreciated the interest he took in me. But working with him was a different story. He was only a step away from retirement, and he was as set in his ways as if his feet had been encased in concrete. He was a short, stubby man with iron gray hair and a stomach that entered a room long before the rest of him. Yet he was as much a part of Eastern as the broad lawn in front of Fields Hall, the Victorian stone mansion that had once been the home of Eastern's founder. His devotion to the school overshadowed everything else. He was sitting in his office staring at his computer screen. "Biggest mistake we ever made, going to online applications," he said to me as I walked in. Nothing beats having a piece of paper in front of you when it comes to evaluating an applicant. That's progress, Joe, I said, sitting down across from him. I was still having a little trouble calling him by his first name, after 4 years of calling him Mr. Degorian. Every other college has gone that way. If we didn't, kids wouldn't bother to apply. So they say, Joe said. What can I do for you, Steve? Mike asked me to talk to you about Marty Moran. Admission at Eastern College is not for sale. Every student competes on his or her own merit. Joe had been able to keep admission standards high, and he had been able to prevent anyone from tampering with the way he did his job, because the applications kept rolling in from the nation's best and brightest. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, was his favorite saying. I agree, but every student is unique, right? I remember when you took me under your wing when I was graduating from high school. I didn't know anything about applying to college, and you helped me through it all. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for you. You had the academic qualifications to be an Eastern student. Marty Moran does not. We don't know that for sure, I said. Sure, he hasn't tested well, and he hasn't performed well in high school, but it could be that he just needs someone to take an interest in him, the way you did with me. He shook his head. You do have the gift of gab, Steve Levitan. I'll give you that. But you're not going to convince me. Have you met his father, Bob Moran? Many times. The man's an egotistical bully. Exactly my point. How can a kid blossom with a father like that? He needs a nurturing environment, the kind that Eastern provides. Joe frowned at me. Your affection for this kid wouldn't have anything to do with the $100,000 his father has promised Mike's foolish campaign, would it? Of course it would, Joe. Think of what that money could do for Eastern. I love this college just as much as you do, but I recognize we have problems. Have you been in the science labs lately? They're still using equipment from the 1970s, and the dorms could use some refurbishing. I could write you a list of things we could use that money for. Hell, I have written those lists. No promises, Joe frowned, but I'll look over his application once more. That's all I can ask. Thanks, Joe. I did like Joe, even though he was the kind of old dinosaur who lumbers around complaining about how different things are and getting in the way of change. A lot of people don't like that, particularly if they're pushing to have things changed. But as I had told him, I recognized the affection he had for Eastern and saw the same thing in myself. If anything, the only thing I cared more about than Eastern and keeping my job there was Rochester. When I got back to my office, he was so glad to see me that I felt warmth creeping through my body, despite the cold weather outside and the cool temperatures inside Fields Hall. The fact that he was jumping all over me helped with that, too. It was 3:30 by then, and I wrestled Rochester into submission long enough to fasten his leash. It was a sunny February day with just a few clouds scattering the light blue sky, and he was excited to get outdoors. We got into my old BMW sedan, and I drove down the hill into Layville, the small town that clusters around the base of the college. The north-south streets, the ones that parallel the Delaware River, are named for trees, while the east-west ones are named after generals of the Revolutionary War. EZ Quick Printers was located at the corner of Beach and Howe, in a rundown neighborhood at the north end of town. I parked in front of the office and left the windows down a bit for Rochester. I began ferrying boxes out of the printers to the trunk of the BMW, leaving it propped open. I was getting the last of the 5 boxes from the clerk when I heard Rochester barking his head off. I grabbed the box and hurried outside. A disheveled man was standing behind the BMW, staring at the boxes in the trunk. He had an electric screwdriver with the back panel off, so I could see there was no battery inside, and he kept putting it up on his head and listening, as if he thought it was a cell phone. Just paper, I said. Nothing worth stealing. Wasn't gonna steal it. The screwdriver slipped in his hand, so he was holding it straight ahead of him in a menacing gesture. I took in his posture, the way he gripped that screwdriver like a weapon, the empty look in his eyes. In a heartbeat, I was back in prison again, standing in the exercise yard. I had learned fast not to show any fear or vulnerability, because that would make me a target. Neither did I want to seem too aggressive, making promises with my mouth that my body couldn't follow through on. Most important was that I had to learn how to act rather than react. I couldn't stand there and wait to see if this guy became a threat to me or to Rochester. "Away from the car, now!" I said in my most commanding voice, one I had begun using in prison and polished in the classroom. Rochester was still barking like mad, so I added, "Or I'll sick the dog on you." Chapter 2. The Grace of God. It was like I'd flipped some kind of switch in the homeless guy. He stuffed his screwdriver in his pocket and backed away. Though my heart was pounding, I stepped toward him, physically forcing him even farther back. I dropped the last box in the trunk and closed it. The man walked around the front of the car to stand on the curb looking at Rochester, who kept on barking. "Dog isn't very friendly, is he?" "He's a good boy." I forced myself not to hurry around the car or to break eye contact with the homeless man until I slid into the driver's seat. As soon as I was beside him, Rochester stopped barking. "It's okay," I said, putting the car in drive and then stroking Rochester's head as we pulled out. "You're a good watchdog." He gave one last bark toward the man, then settled back on the seat, and my adrenaline level began to drop. For a small town, Layville had more than its share of homeless men and women. Some of the students were easy marks, and there were lots of college dumpsters around. I thought I might have seen that guy hanging around the campus sometimes, but I wasn't sure. It was scary the way my prison training had popped up at the first sign of conflict. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. I had spent the last year trying to put everything behind me, Mary's miscarriages, the divorce, my unfortunate incarceration. But thinking I could forget about it all was a foolish idea. Back up at campus, I parked once again behind Fields Hall and took Rochester to my office. Then I began ferrying the printer's boxes to the ballroom. Though the old building had been renovated a few times, the ballroom was kept as it had been in the 1850s, with high ceilings and elaborate chandeliers, swagged curtains, and a polished parquet floor. It was still used for faculty meetings, concerts, and other events. In 2 days, it would be the main venue for our campaign launch party. But for now, it was a scene of organized chaos, with long folding tables laden with printed materials lining the walls. I joined the line and spent the next hour assembling packets. By the time I was done, it was time to pick up Rochester and go home. "Things are only going to get crazier over the next couple of days, Rochester," I said, turning onto the river road toward Stewart's Crossing. "I still have a million things to finish before the launch party." He didn't say anything, but it didn't matter. I just liked having him as a sounding board. If I had to pinpoint the one thing I missed most from my married life, I'd say it was the chance to talk to somebody else about my day. Mary and I had eaten dinner together most nights, sharing complaints and inspirations. Toward the end of our marriage, when she was deep into depression over her miscarriages, I felt like I had lost more than just those 2 babies. I had lost the person I was most connected to in the world. Rochester had become my substitute. In exchange for a warm place to sleep, food, treats, and care, he gave me unconditional love. He was always there when I worried about job prospects, meeting with my parole officer, or the general loneliness of single life. He sat curled on the seat next to me, listening, as we drove through the dark night back to our welcoming little townhouse. He had a quick pee, and then we went inside. "I'm not complaining, you understand," I said, as he sat on his haunches watching me prepare his dinner. "Despite everything, I'm grateful for my life. I've met a lot of guys in prison who didn't have the opportunities I had. A pair of loving parents, a stable home environment, a reasonably high IQ, and the ability to use it." I put down his bowl of chow, topped with a dollop of canned pumpkin to keep him regular, and started fixing my own dinner. Rochester was a big part of my rehabilitation. When I came back to Bucks County, I was hiding behind emotional walls I thought I needed to protect me from further harm. He had showed me that I could enjoy myself again, that I could love another creature without fear. After dinner, I checked some emails, with Rochester curled around the back of my desk chair, as if keeping me under control. Then we went to the bedroom, and he jumped up on the bed next to me as we watched TV together. The next 2 days zoomed past, filled with party planning and press relations details. I barely had time to take Rochester out for a couple of quick trips during the day. I had debated leaving him home the day of the party. Despite his loving nature, he was something of a loose cannon, and I was afraid he'd sneak out of my office and terrorize the party guests with his big paws and lolling tongue. But I couldn't leave him at home from early morning until late at night, so I settled for bringing in extra toys and a brand new rawhide bone, which I gave him as the caterers began arriving. Then I warned him to be good and locked my office door. I walked down to the ballroom and spotted one of the laborers carrying a huge pile of tablecloths bundled with plastic cling wrap. "Those are the wrong color," I said. "Eastern's blue is a light blue, like the summer sky. These are navy." The laborer continued walking in the room, dropping the pile on a round wooden table. "They told me blue, these are blue." "These are navy blue." He looked at me like I was nuts, and I pulled out my cell phone to call the caterer's office. Mike McCormick came in as I was dialing, trailed by two football players who were often his shadows, both wearing Eastern football jerseys. Juan Tanamera and Jose Canusi were Puerto Rican boys from Jersey City, both fullbacks, and you never saw one without the other. "Those are the wrong blue," Mike said. "I know, I'm on it." "You shouldn't have let it get this far," he said. "Did you specify the right color to them? Did you check before they packed the cloths up for transport?" "Calm down, Mike. I said I'm taking care of it." "Jesus Christ, it's going to kill us if we don't get Eastern's colors right. You know how many alumni will bitch and moan?" "I know, Mike. I told you, I'm on it." Or I would be, as soon as he left me alone long enough to make the call. Fortunately, he saw a couple of guys setting up the bandstand in the wrong corner of the ballroom and took off, shouting, "Do I have to micromanage every person around here?" Juan and Jose looked at me like they were his enforcers or something, but I glared at them and they followed him across the room. I took a couple of deep breaths. I couldn't go off on Mike the way I had the homeless man the other day. Mike was my boss, and if I lost this job, I'd be out in the cold. Just remember that guy, I thought. There, but for the grace of God, go I. The grace of God, that is, and Rochester, who kept me sane and made me feel loved. Just before the guests started arriving, I took him out for a quick run around the back of Fields Hall. One great thing about my office, besides the gorgeous view of the campus, was the easy access to the outdoors. If I wanted to, I could avoid the labyrinthine corridors of the former mansion and just walk around the outside of the building. The ballroom was just around the corner. Even in the middle of winter, the Eastern campus was a beautiful place, but the college hadn't always been in such verdant surroundings. It had been founded as a charity school for orphan boys in 1835 with a meager enrollment, scrabbling for donations from the public to keep its orphans in sackcloth and school books. It attracted the attention of Old Man Fields, a shrewd operator and himself an orphan from Birmingham, England. The clayey soil of the Delaware Valley was perfect for the manufacture of porcelain and tile, and down the river in Trenton, artists like Walter Scott Lennox were making fancy china to rival the best Europeans. But Fields chose to concentrate on items like toilet fixtures and floor tiles, which flowed out of his factories along the canals that paralleled the shallow Delaware all the way to Philadelphia. Rather than create a foundation to do charitable works and revere his portrait, Fields left Eastern the bulk of his estate, several $1 million worth of steel and coal stocks, and within a year, Eastern left its single red brick building and moved to this gray marble mansion. The campus was unusually quiet, as we were in the middle of Eastern's winter break, when the students go home and the professors retire to their libraries. Rochester sniffed his way around a couple of pine trees and peed at the base of the marble sundial, and we walked back to my office through the French doors. As soon as I'd unhooked him and sent him to his bed, my cell phone rang, and I struggled to hear the crackling call from a Pascal Montrouge, a reporter from the Bucks County Courier-Times, who had gotten lost on the way to the college. It wasn't like the place was hard to find. Eastern straddled a hill overlooking the Delaware, between Yardley and New Hope. Any reporter who covered the county had to know where the place was. But I reined in my impatience and gave Montrouge the directions. Then I walked out to the reception table, where each guest had to pass by Barbara and Jeremy, a pair of fresh-faced undergrads from the Booster Club who helped out at campus events. Barbara had dressed for the occasion in a scooped-neck black taffeta dress and high heels, with her straight blonde hair piled up on her head. But Jeremy looked like he was going to class, in a preppy button-down shirt and khakis. "How's it going, guys?" I asked, scanning the ranks of name tags still to be picked up and the empty spaces between. "Looks like about, 20% are here so far?" 23.5, Jeremy said. Barbara beamed. "Jeremy is majoring in math. He's so smart." Jeremy blushed. "Do you remember me, Mr. Levitan? I was in your freshman comp class last year." "Of course," I said, though that was a tough class, ending in multiple murders, and I tried to forget about it. "Really wild what happened to Menno and Melissa, huh?" "And sad," I said. "Yeah." I was trying to figure out how to avoid talking more about that class when a tall, balding man in a camel hair coat walked up, and I stepped aside. Barbara jumped up. "Daddy, you came!" "Told you I would," he said. "Richard Seville," the girl said to Jeremy. "He's my father." "I guessed." Jeremy handed the man a name tag. "There's a coat check right behind you, sir." "I need to stay here for a while and then I'll come find you," Barbara said. She turned back to me. "Sorry, Mr. Levitan. Is there anything else we can do for you?" "Just keep on being friendly and welcoming the guests. I'll come back and check in with you later." I walked past the tables groaning with pâté, fried mozzarella squares, cheese, fruits, stuffed mushrooms, and other hors d'oeuvres, and made a pit stop at the bar. As I was turning away with a glass of white wine, Joe DeGorian came up to me. "I can't believe this terrible waste of money," he said, shaking his head. "Think of the scholarships we could have given for the cost of this event." "Haven't you and Mike been over this 100 times, Joe? We need to spend a little money to make more money. I'm sure this party is going to bring in 10 or 20 times what it cost in pledges to the campaign." "If the campaign works out," Joe said. "You know my opinion on that. $500 million is too much money for us to expect to raise. We're only a small college. We're not Harvard or Yale, as much as John William Babson would like us to think." He pointed through the ballroom doors to where Eastern's president was spreading his considerable personal charm among a group of wealthy alumni. "Look at him. You'd think he was some sort of slick Wall Street executive instead of a dignified academic. We ought to forget all this silliness about fundraising and public relations and get back to what we do best, educating the young." As we watched Babson laugh and glad-hand, a tall woman, almost my height, came up to join us. She had masses of reddish-brown hair and red-framed glasses with circular lenses. Her exotic beauty was magnified by the 1940s style of her off-the-shoulder dress, in a tropical pattern of palm trees and parrots. She had a black silk shawl artfully draped over her unclothed arm. "Good evening, Dr. Weinstock," Joe said. "You look quite lovely tonight, but then I'd expect a sense of style from the new chair of the Fine Arts Department." He introduced me to her, and I shook her slim hand, adorned with a series of wire-thin gold rings. She smiled, and I felt a frisson of attraction between us. "Dr. Weinstock," I said. "Please, call me Lily. I get enough Dr. Weinstock from my students." She smiled. "Joe was on the committee that hired me. They asked some tough questions." "Which you answered perfectly," he said, "and your portfolio was quite impressive." "Are you a painter?" I looked down at her hand again, expecting to see bits of paint beneath her nails, but instead she had an elegant French manicure. "A photographer, but I supervise faculty in painting, drawing, and sculpture, so I've been plunged into all their controversies and concerns." "Ah, the life of an academic." I wanted nothing more than to stand there for the rest of the evening, flirting with the lovely chair of the Fine Arts Department, but duty called. As I walked away, I thought that if God truly was graceful, I would get a chance to get to know Lily Weinstock better. Soon, if at all possible. Chapter 3. The Pursuit of Excellence. I left the bar and walked back out to the lobby of Fields Hall, looking for that lost reporter. I saw Juan and Jose, Mike's pet fullbacks, standing at the front door pretending to be security, and I smiled to myself. Then I heard the sound of someone singing scales and followed it down the hall to the admissions office. Outside the door, I ran into Sally Marston. "Have you seen Joe?" she asked, pushing the door open. "I want him to talk to Bob Moran." "Did somebody say Bob Moran?" The voice belonged to Ike Karumba, the leader of the college's a cappella singing group, the Rising Sons of Eastern. He burst into song singing, "Bob, Bob, 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 Bob Moran, oh Bob Moran, please take my hand." Then the rest of the group, a half a dozen pimply-faced teens, joined him, and I recognized it as a parody of the Beach Boys song, Barbara Ann. The Rising Sun specialized in that kind of mashup, putting new words to old melodies. They wore Eastern College sweatshirts, embellished with the college's Rising Sun logo, khaki slacks, and straw boaters that were supposed to remind people of old-fashioned a cappella groups. Ike was a tall, skinny senior from Wyoming who volunteered in the admissions office, helping Eastern recruit in the western and mountain regions. When they finished singing, he said, "Hope you don't mind us using your office to rehearse, Miss Marston. We'll clear out now, though." "It's all right with me, Ike. Have you seen Mr. DeGorian?" He shook his head. "We're just going to go outside for a quick smoke. If I see him on the way, I'll tell him you're looking for him." The guys filed out, and I looked at Sally. I was surprised that a bunch of college singers would be smoking cigarettes, especially right before a performance. Behind their backs, she mimed putting a joint to her mouth and inhaling deeply. "The last time I saw Joe, he was at the bar," I said. So Sally and I went back to the ballroom together, but Joe wasn't there. We stopped at the front door, watching Babson operate on the room. His wife, Henrietta, was next to him, along with their daughters, Penelope, Lenore, and Denise, or Henny, Penny, Lenny, and Denny, as he called them. "The man's a megalomaniac," Sally said with wonderment. "I'm continually amazed at him. To hear him talk, you'd think the Holy Trinity was Harvard, Yale, and Eastern. No, make that Eastern, Harvard, and Yale." I laughed. "This party's his big show. Look around you, all these tuxedos, diamonds, the Eastern strings over there, even down to the name tags and the ice buckets. They're all here because of him. He's the force that got this campaign going, and if we do raise this $500 million, it'll be all because of him." $500 million. I still marvel at that. They say it's the largest sum a small college has ever tried to raise. Across from us, Babson spotted me and motioned. I made my apologies to Sally and crossed the crowded parquet floor to him. He was a commanding figure in his tuxedo and spit-polished Italian dress shoes, a dignified small carnation crowning his lapel. "Are you ready to get started?" I asked. "It's about time, don't you think?" "After you speak, if you don't mind, I'd like you to talk to a couple of reporters. The Layville Gazette is here, as well as a couple of papers from Allentown and Bethlehem. Pascal Montrouge from the Courier-Times is around somewhere, and I hope the Philadelphia Inquirer will send their education reporter too." "Mind? Of course I don't mind. That's what I'm here for. You just gather them up for me. Say, why don't you have the strings play that fast version of Mother Eastern, How We Love Thee as the first dance? It comes out sort of like a cha-cha." "Good idea, sir." Babson and I walked over to the small dais set up along the wall of the French doors that faced out to the valley. Lights glimmered along the hillsides and spotlights illuminated the back lawn. In warmer weather, the volleyball team practiced there, and sun-seeking undergrads spread their blankets there at the first breath of spring. President Babson mounted the dais. He motioned to the band, which played a little drum flourish, and then he began speaking. "Since her founding 150 years ago," he boomed, "Eastern has ranked among the most outstanding and selective institutions of higher education in this country. We have enjoyed the reputation of being a member of the Little Ivy League." His words echoed around the large, high-ceilinged room. Babson was tall and raw-boned, but instead of being taciturn, he bubbled over with enthusiasm, no matter what the subject or his knowledge of it. He had deep green eyes and dark curly hair that he styled with the kind of greasy kid stuff I had abandoned when I reached puberty. When I recall talking to him as a student, it's the eyes I remember and how I wanted to avoid them. But the tables were turned tonight, and Babson wasn't glaring at me for some college prank, but talking from notes I'd written. and his eyes were trained on those rich folks in the audience who could make his dream of Eastern come true. He paused strategically. The room was completely still. Wind whistled softly at the windows behind Babson, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw Joe slip out of the ballroom door to the hallway. Not surprising that he'd lose patience with Babson's fundraising speech. The aim of this campaign is to enable Eastern to take her true place among the great colleges and universities of the world, Babson said. Throughout the next 5 years of the campaign, and for years to come, we will continue to provide the stellar education that makes us proud to call Eastern alma mater. The audience erupted with applause. I turned to Sally, who had appeared beside me. Isn't he amazing? He makes me think we just might pull this off. As long as Joe doesn't cause any more problems. I overheard him complaining to an alum about the wastefulness of this campaign and telling the man that if he wanted to make a contribution, he should be sure to direct it to scholarships, not the campaign. I groaned. He needs to keep his mouth shut or retire. Sally brushed a crumb from her party dress, a taffeta number that looked like a bridesmaid dress with the flounces cut off. You know he'll never leave Eastern as long as he's breathing. This college means everything to him. His vision of it, that is. Babson introduced the Eastern strings, and they played the first dance, that fast cha-cha version of Mother Eastern. Sally said, I'd better keep looking for Joe. I don't want him to run up against Bob Moran without an escort. Who knows what he'll say? I saw him walk out halfway through Babson's speech, but I had a talk with him the other day. He might be mellowing toward Marty Moran. And the polar caps might melt tomorrow. She looked around. I don't see Bob Moran anywhere either. I hope they aren't off somewhere arguing. Sally went in one direction, and I went the other, toward a pair of glass doors that led to the garden. It was too cold to let the party spill outside, but we had lit up the garden to show off its beauty. As I stood there, the rising sun stampeded inside past me, leaving the faint smell of marijuana in their wake. Ike Karumba wasn't with them, though. I saw the reporter I'd been looking for, Pascal Montrouge of the Bucks County Courier-Times, a tall, handsome Frenchman who was a bit too oily for my taste. We had a quick conversation about Eastern and the campaign, and he promised to come up to the campus in the next couple of weeks for a more in-depth profile. Just as I said goodbye to him, Ike came hurrying past me. He looked agitated. I guess the marijuana didn't mellow him out. We're going to sing in a couple of minutes, he said to me. You see where the guys went? Toward the ballroom. I watched him go, then turned toward a display of flowers on a side table. Someone had knocked the table and half the blooms had tumbled out. By the time I had the flowers gathered, I heard the Rising Suns begin singing and went back to the ballroom. After 3 a cappella harmonies, they led the crowd into a stirring rendition of Hail Alma Mater, We Are Thy Sons and True. I heard its words, composed by a couple of drunken grads at a maudlin reunion, and felt proud to be back at Eastern. I owed the school something. They had given me an excellent education for almost nothing, had nurtured my mind, body, and spirit, and that reminded me that I had promised to help Sally find Joe. So I went back on the prowl. As I passed the glass doors to the garden, Nora Leadham came inside, rubbing her hands together. She was Joe's ex-wife, a poet in the English department who also ran the Visiting Writers series. She defied my expectations of a woman poet. She was short, wiry, and athletic, and ran half marathons as a hobby. You must have a strong constitution, I said, going out in this cold without a coat. At least her dress was more practical than Sally's, an ankle length in maroon velvet with long sleeves. It was as simple and spare as her usual jeans and cotton shirts. I'm from Vermont, Steve. We don't wear coats until the weather drops into single digits. I wondered if she'd been smoking with the Rising Suns, but that really wasn't my business. Enjoying the party? I asked. You never know where you're going to get inspiration. I've been turning the idea for a poem over in my head, and something that happened outside just might be the key to figuring out what I want to say. She smiled. Sorry I can't be more concrete than that right now. I have to let the images stew around in my brain for a while. She looked at me. We miss you over in the English department, Steve. Any chance of you coming back to teach? Maybe in the fall. I really do like teaching, but right now I think I could make my best contribution to Eastern on the staff. I have a couple of students this semester who had freshman comp with you. They speak very highly of you, and they write pretty well too. Thanks, I'm flattered. Just then I looked beyond her and saw a streak of gold rush past. Uh-oh, my dog must have gotten out of my office. I have to go after him. I left Nora behind as I ran out the door calling, "Rochester, where are you? Get back here!" I ran toward the sound of his barking, but there was a prickly hedge in the way and I had to detour around it. I stumbled on a rock and lost my balance, nearly falling, then slid in a murky place, cursing the damn dog the whole time. "Rochester, I'm going to kill you when I find you," I called. He just kept barking. Finally, I came around a stand of pine trees to see him standing next to a pile of something on the ground. I rushed across the ground toward him. "Bad dog," I said. "How did you get out of my office?" He barked again, shaking his head, and I stepped sideways, letting the light from the ballroom illuminate what he was looking at. Joe DeGorian lay sprawled on the lawn. Rich red blood oozed from a wound at his neck, staining the dark green grass. Chapter 4. How to Throw a Party. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket and dialed 911, my hands shaking from a combination of the cold, fear, and being out of breath. I managed to tell the operator who I was, where I was, and why I needed the police as soon as possible. All the while I had to restrain Rochester, who kept trying to sniff Joe's body. His tuxedo jacket had come open, and the blood dripped down his white shirt, disappearing below his black cummerbund. His face was pale, and his eyes gazed sightlessly up. He didn't appear to be breathing, and from the massive amount of blood I could see, I knew there was nothing I could do to help him. When I finished with the cops, I called campus security as well. I felt helpless and flashed back to when I had discovered Carolyn Kelly's body a year before. She had been beyond anything I could do, too. I knelt down and wrapped my arm around Rochester's neck, and he rubbed his cold nose against my hands. In the distance, I heard the sound of the party going on in the ballroom. The contrast was striking. Here was Joe, who had devoted his life to Eastern, dead just as we had assembled hundreds of people to celebrate the college. I felt a profound sense of grief at seeing a man I admired whose life had just been snuffed out. I was still huddled against Rochester for warmth when a security guard came up in his little golf cart. "What's going on?" he said, not getting out of the cart. I pointed at Joe, my teeth chattering. He shone his flashlight toward Joe and said, "Jesus, that's Mr. DeGorian, isn't it? Did you call the police?" I nodded. "You'd better get inside," the guard said. "You're going to freeze out here. I'll wait for the cops." He shook his head, then began playing his flashlight around the grounds, as if Joe's killer was still lurking behind the shrubbery. I grabbed Rochester's collar and dragged him across the lawn to the French doors to my office. He'd knocked open the handle, and I closed and locked it again. Fortunately, the door hadn't been open long, so the office was still pretty warm. Looking down at my hands, I saw red dots on my fingers. I realized they had to be Joe's blood. But how had I gotten blood on my hands? I hadn't touched him at all. Then I looked at Rochester. He had a red smudge on his nose. "Oh, yuck," I said. "Rochester, were you sniffing blood? That's just gross." I rummaged in my desk drawer for some moistened wipes and cleaned up my hands and Rochester's nose. Then I pulled a couple of tiny T-bones from the tree jar. Rochester gulped them greedily. I rubbed my arms, trying to warm up. "I guess I should go back out to the party, huh?" Rochester just sat on his haunches staring expectantly at me. Wearily, I stood up. "Don't go anywhere," I said to him. I checked the lock on the French doors, then locked my office door behind me. Back in the ballroom, I looked for Babson, but he was nowhere in sight. The Rising Suns were just finishing another song. The audience clustered around appreciatively. I was still in shock and operating on automatic pilot, but I managed to climb a few steps up the dais next to the Rising Suns. Ike looked at me in surprise, and I motioned a quick slice against my throat. only too late realizing that I'd probably mined the method of Joe's death as well as a message to stop singing. The audience erupted in applause for the Rising Suns. I waited a couple of beats before I said, "Ladies and gentlemen." I had to repeat it 3 times before the room was quiet. "I'm afraid that there has been an unfortunate occurrence this evening. We would appreciate it if you would all remain here for a few minutes until the police and the ambulance arrive." The audience started buzzing as a siren sounded in the distance, a low whine that grew in intensity. "If you'd all please be patient," I said, though it didn't have much effect on the crowd. I looked around for Babson again, but I still couldn't see him. The ambulance ground to a halt outside, the flashing red lights strobing the ballroom, and the tension level in the ballroom escalated another couple of notches. Women were clutching their evening bags, men talking to each other and pulling out cell phones. Everyone wanted to know what was going on. A pair of uniformed police stepped in the door of the ballroom, followed by Tony Rinaldi. He was a detective in the Layville Police Department, a chunky guy of about my age with a baby face and a head of thick black hair. I'd had some dealings with him in the past. The crowd began clustering around the door to the ballroom, and Tony had to fight his way through them, repeating his excuses as he tried to calm people down. By the time he made it to the dais, the crowd's attention had shifted from the door to him. "Quiet, please!" He clapped his hands together hard, and people looked up in surprise. "No one is in danger, but none of you will be allowed to leave the building until you have been interviewed by the police. Form an orderly line and we'll get you out of here as soon as possible."
"What happened?"
A man called from the side of the room. I recognized him as Richard Seville, Barbara's father. He had his camel hair coat over his arm. I figured he'd been on his way out of the party when the cops stopped him. "Yes, tell us," a woman said. From the side of the room, Bob Moran called out, "You can't keep us in the dark." An ironic comment from a guy who sold electric cars. His wife and son were at his side. Babson appeared at the foot of the dais. "What's going on?" he demanded. "Why are the police here?" "I'm not at liberty to provide any details right now," Tony announced to the crowd. "The quickest way to get out of here tonight is going to be to cooperate. All troublemakers will be isolated to be dealt with after the rest of the crowd is allowed to depart." There was more grumbling, but at least no one challenged him. I stepped down from the dais and spoke to President Babson as the officers began forming an interview line. I explained what I had found and that I had called the police. "You should have tried to find me first," he said. "I need to know what's going on. And Joe, why, he was one of my oldest friends." He looked pale and shaken. "I thought my first priority had to be to call the police," I said. "I did look around for you before I spoke to the crowd, but I couldn't find you. I had to make sure that no one left before the police got here." "This changes everything," he said, shaking his head. "My God, Joe." Mike McCormick approached us from the side of the ballroom, and Babson turned to him. "I need to speak to you, Mike, in my office, now. Steve, you stay here and try to keep the damage to a minimum." He turned and stalked out, followed by Mike. I stood there, still in shock, thinking of Joe and trying to ignore the fact that this murder had happened at Eastern, where I was responsible for creating a good public image. At the door, several officers took names and addresses and asked questions about what they had seen. All the reporters were clustered around Tony, badgering him for a statement, and I asked them to meet me in a corner of the ballroom. There were half a dozen of them, including Pascal Montrouge and a stringer from the Inquirer who lived in Layville and occasionally sold a story to national magazines as well. "You sure know how to throw a party, Steve," Montrouge said. "This'll make page 1 for sure. I'd like to speed up my timetable to come back up here with a photographer to take some pictures. Get some background on the college. How's tomorrow? Will you be available?" His eyes gleamed. "Everything related to the campaign, of course. Excellence for Eastern, and all that." "I doubt if I'll be leaving on vacation, although I might want to." "You have a statement for us?" the stringer asked. "Not yet. I'm going to meet with President Babson in a few minutes." "You all have Blackberries or smartphones, right?" Everyone nodded. "I'll email a statement to you." As a group, they turned to go back to Tony, and as they did, he caught my eye and said, "I want to talk to you. Don't leave the campus without telling me." I nodded, then slumped against a wall for a few minutes, trying to regroup. After a while, I took a couple of deep breaths and returned to my office. Rochester was waiting just inside the door for me, and he jumped up and put his paws on my thighs. As always, being with him made me feel better. I scratched behind his ears, and he lay down on the carpet. I got down next to him and rubbed his belly. Barbara and Jeremy appeared at the door of my office. "We cleaned up the registration table and brought you the name tags and lists, Mr. Levitan," she said. "Are you okay?" "Just spending some quality time with Rochester," I said, standing up. "Thanks for your help tonight." "It was fun," she said. "That is, until Mr. Degorian got killed. This is the first time I was ever someplace where somebody got murdered. It was creepy." "Don't think too much about it, but you should get security to run you back to the dorm." Barbara smiled and put her arm through Jeremy's. "It's okay. Jeremy will walk with me." I shook my head. "Barbara, a man was killed here tonight. We don't know who did it or if that person is still hanging around on the campus. Have security drive you both." She looked at Jeremy and he nodded. "Thanks, Mr. Levitan. We'll do that," he said. I turned on my computer and tried to compose a statement for the press about Joe's murder. My hands were still shaking a bit, and it was hard to focus, but after a half hour I had something drafted. I printed it, then left Rochester with his rawhide bone and went down the hall to Mike's office, where he and Babson were still talking about the potential damage to the campaign. I handed Babson the statement. He barely looked at it. "It looks fine, Steve. I can't focus on anything more tonight. We'll meet tomorrow morning to go over things." He stood up and stretched. "You both should go home. Tomorrow's going to be a tough day." I wanted nothing more than to leave, but I had promised Tony I would wait around to talk to him. It took the better part of an hour before he was ready for me. By the time he came into my office, I was sitting behind my desk. Rochester jumped up and rushed toward him, nosing him right in the crotch. "So I understand this dog is getting into trouble again," he said, sitting down in the spindly chair across from my desk. Rochester sprawled at his feet. Back when Tony was investigating a couple of deaths in Layville that were related to Carolyn's death, I had tried to convince him that Rochester had special abilities when it came to solving crimes, but he didn't buy it. "Rochester led me to Joe's body," I said. "He broke out of here and went running toward Joe, and I saw him and followed him." I walked through what I had done with him, how I'd been in the hallway and seen Rochester streak past, then gone to chase him. "Your office wasn't locked?" Tony asked. "It was, but I think Rochester forced the handle on the French door." I stood up and walked over to it. "He figured out that he can push the handle down with his paws if he's scratching." I demonstrated. The door was locked, but when I pushed really hard, the latch popped. So much for college security. Rochester lay on his side, with one paw over his face, as if he wasn't watching what was going on. "So, he just decided to break out?" Tony asked. "I guess. You'd have to ask him if he saw or heard anything." "Right. You see anyone coming or going as you ran after him?" I shook my head. "Any idea why the dog would be out there, or Degorian?" "No, on both counts." "I probably could get better answers from the dog," he said. "Listen, I've got a lot to cover tonight. I'll come back tomorrow and we'll talk some more." As he was leaving, Sally came in, carrying a big shopping bag full of plastic containers, looking pale and drawn. "I can't believe Joe is dead. I feel so terrible." Tony nodded at her and said, "Tomorrow," then walked out. "Well, at least the kickoff is sure to make the papers now," I said dryly. "Isn't it lucky we invited all those reporters and wined and dined them, too?" "The Strings want to know if they'll get paid for the whole evening. The violinist said it was probably some disgruntled parent whose kid didn't get in." She rubbed her upper arms. "Can you imagine killing someone for something like that?" "The Strings will get all we promised them. Anyone who can play Mother Eastern as a cha-cha has my admiration." "You know, I feel like this is all part of some gruesome college theater production," Sally said. Rochester came over to sniff her shopping bag, and she opened up a container and gave him a filet mignon tidbit. That made her his friend for life. I keep hoping Joe will stand up sometime, take a bow, and give us Puck's speech from the end of A Midsummer's Night Dream. Absently, she handed Rochester another tidbit, which he wolfed greedily. Honestly, you'd think I never fed him. "If we mortals have offended, think but this, and all is mended," I quoted, "that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear." Wow, you know that by heart? I taught the play last semester. I stood up and found Rochester's leash. "Time to go home, puppy." He did his manic kangaroo routine, jumping and turning around and doing his best to keep me from hooking the leash. I pulled on my coat, and Sally zipped up hers and packed up her bag. As the three of us were leaving Fields Hall, a security guard confronted us and asked Sally and me for identification. "Sorry for the inconvenience, folks," he said when we had showed him our campus ID cards. "We've increased security patrols because of the murder. You be careful walking around now. The police have been out back in the garden, but the rest of the campus is, well, whoever killed Mr. Degorian could still be around." "We'll be careful," I said. "Both of us are parked right behind the building." "Let's face it, Steve, Layville isn't as safe as we'd like it to be," Sally said as we stepped outside. "Sometimes I get really scared when I'm walking to my car if there's no one around." I remembered the homeless man who had menaced me in Rochester at the printers. Sally was right. The campus could be scary sometimes, especially at times like this when students were off on a break, with a killer on the loose. We walked down the broad, curving driveway toward the parking lot, enveloped by a velvety darkness. Rochester and I dropped Sally off at her car, and he stopped periodically to sniff and pee. Above us, thousands of stars twinkled. "Such a beautiful night," I said. "It's hard to believe something so horrible just happened." A car with a noisy muffler rushed past us, and I shivered. As I drove home, the streets were still and quiet, but I knew someone, somewhere in that peaceful town, or just on the highways leading away, had blood on his hands. Joe's murder was a puzzle, and since I had decoded my first childhood rebuses and threaded my way out of cartoon mazes, I had been unable to resist an intellectual challenge. "I can't figure it out," I said to Rochester. "Why would someone want to kill Joe, and why tonight of all nights? I mean, think of the risks. Over 300 people, and any one of them could have seen the killer go into the garden with Joe or seen him cut Joe's throat. And come to think of it, if you were wearing a tuxedo, how would you get rid of a bloody knife?" I kept thinking about it as I got undressed. From an intellectual standpoint, it made no sense. The risks were too great. Was the violinist correct that Joe had been killed by a disgruntled parent? Who would care so much about sending a kid to Eastern to kill over it? I mean, Eastern's a good school, but despite what Babson believes, it's not exactly Harvard. Then again, if you wanted lots of other suspects, a big party was just the ticket. Ample opportunities for alibis. Joe had left the ballroom halfway through Babson's speech, and anyone who had an eye on him could have followed him and come at him unawares. Or Joe could have gone willingly to the garden with someone. Any alumnus who needed a private word about an applicant, any faculty member, or fellow staffer. Was Joe's death something personal, something to do with his job, or a crime against the college? What if Joe had surprised someone out in the garden, a thief there to break into cars, for example, or any other kind of criminal? And if I were Hercule Poirot, would I have an accent and a silly mustache? Rochester settled on the floor next to my bed and went right to sleep, but I couldn't nod off. I kept thinking about Joe, and somewhere around 3 o'clock I decided I was going to find out who killed him myself. Though I trusted Tony to investigate the crime, I didn't think anyone else at Eastern cared enough about Joe to help Tony out. My job might depend on my ability to make people feel safe on campus again, and feel good enough about Eastern to open their wallets. I didn't think I could feel good until whoever cut Joe's throat was behind locked prison doors, just the way I'd been. Chapter 6. Administrative Changes. "You can't tell me the dog knew that knife was there," Tony said as he pulled an evidence bag from the pocket of his insulated jacket. "I'm not telling you anything," I said. "You saw it for yourself." Tony leaned down and, using the bag over his hand, pulled the knife from the soil. There were brown stains on the blade, and though they could have been dirt, I was willing to bet they were blood. Rochester did have blood on his nose last night, I said. And you saw the way he had his nose to the ground. It's possible he was tracking that smell. Uh-huh. Recognize this? Tony asked. It looks like one of the knives from the kitchen in Fields Hall, I said. There were a lot of them out on the tables, to slice cheese and so on. Tony made a note. Then he looked down at Rochester. Anything else you want to show us while we're out here? I could hear an edge of sarcasm in his voice, but there was something else, too, perhaps a resigned acceptance. Rochester shook his head and barked. We waited by the tree for Tony to go back to his car and get some yellow "Do Not Cross" tape and a couple of stakes, and then I helped him isolate the area around the tree. By the time we were finished, a tech from the crime scene team showed up to look for more evidence, and Tony, Rochester, and I went back to my office. You have a list of guests who were here last night? Tony asked. I need to cross-reference it against the names we collected at the door. About that list, I said. You won't make too much of a fuss with those people, will you? I realize you have to find out who killed Joe, but those donors and friends are all very important to us. Don't worry, I just have some routine questions. We saved the spotlight and the waterboarding for later in the investigation. I thought he smiled briefly. As we walked into my office, the phone rang again. Busy today, he said. You get a crazy little thing called murder and everything changes, I quoted back to him. He sat down across from my desk and waited for me to finish my conversation. Rochester sprawled next to him, and Tony even scratched behind the dog's ears. When I hung up, he pulled out his yellow legal pad again and said, I'd like you to tell me exactly what you did and said last night. He took notes as I recreated the evening in minute detail. So the first people you saw coming in from outside were these kids from the singing group? The Rising Sons, all except Ike Karumba. He's the leader. He didn't come back in for a few minutes after the rest of them. Ike Karumba? Is that his real name or some kind of Desi Arnaz Babalu alias? Far as I know, it's his real name. He made another note. How long was he outside after the rest of them had come in? I frowned. Can't say for sure. I saw a reporter I'd been looking for, and we had a conversation. Maybe 10 minutes? And how long after he came in did Nora Leadham follow him? That was a while, I said. The Rising Sun sang a couple of numbers, at least 15 or 20 minutes. We sat silently for a minute while he finished his notes. He stood and I saw the holster slung around his hips, the billy club and the handcuffs that hung from one side. I'll be in touch. He picked up his hat and slung his coat over his shoulder. He jangled as he walked out the door, and I had a crazy urge to salute him, which I am pleased to say I held back. He must have gone down the hall to speak to Sally after he left me, because around 1 o'clock she came into my office beaming. I'm officially not a suspect, she said. Thank God. I spoke to that police detective, and it looks like I can prove that I was inside during the whole party. Congratulations. What do you say we grab some sandwiches and celebrate? Sally agreed, so I got my coat and met her in the lobby. As we walked outside, I said, So have you planned any major changes in admissions yet? Well, for starters, I sent an acceptance letter to Marty Moran. I don't have the balls Joe had to argue with President Babson and Mike McCormick. After that, I'm thinking of a few things. Sally stuffed her hands in her pockets and leaned forward as we walked down the hill to Main Street in Layville. You know, Joe never let me change anything around here. Well, I've been talking to Babson for a while now. He was hoping Joe would retire in a year or two and I'd get his position then. Joe getting killed just sort of speeds up the agenda. We stopped at Sunrise Deli, where we ordered sandwiches at the counter. As we ate, we talked about life at Eastern, trading the kind of gossip and griping that coworkers always do. Who was mad at who, whose office was in trouble, oh, and who might have murdered Joe. I just can't imagine somebody killing him, she shivered. I know what you mean, but Tony's a good guy. I trust him to figure things out. I picked up an extra couple of slices of roast beef for Rochester. When I got into my office, Mike's work-study assistant, Dijon, was waiting for me. She was a short, chunky girl who had been in my class the semester before. I remembered how the roster in that class was like a grocery list. A boy called Filet, 2 girls named Honey and Cinnamon, in addition to Dijon. I always wondered if she had been named after the mustard, but had never asked her. She had huge circular holes in each earlobe and a rotating set of weird earrings, usually flat discs in electric colors. Today's were bright red and matched her lipstick. A couple of dark curls had come loose from her ponytail, and she looked frazzled. "Oh, Mr. Levitan, I'm glad you're back. The phone hasn't stopped ringing, and President Babson was hunting for you. He said the police were terrible, and he's worried that if they talk to all the guests, they'll ruin our fundraising forever. He's meeting with Mr. McCormick in his office now, and he wants you to go down there as soon as you get in." "Thanks, Dejan. Don't worry, he just gets excited." The phone rang and she picked it up. "Hi," she said. Thank you for calling the Office of Public Relations and Publicity at Eastern College. How may I help you?" I smiled and walked into my office, where I hung up my coat, took a swig of cold water from a bottle on my desk, and went down the hall to Babson's office. I found him sitting on the corner of his desk, his long, lanky frame leaning over Mike McCormick's shoulder, peering at a set of figures. His blue wool suit jacket was still buttoned, and it strained across his chest. "Come in, Steve, come in," he said. "We're trying to assess the damages last night caused." "Before we go any further, sir, I want to say I'm sorry it didn't turn out as we planned. I still believe it was a good idea, if it had gone smoothly." "No one's blaming you, Steve. I was all for the party, and I'm not going to waste time crying over it. Let's just figure out how to move on from here," Mike said. "The good news is that we've gotten more press for Eastern than any of us hoped for, and every article mentions the campaign and Eastern's reputation. It'll certainly enhance our recognition factor, and once the excitement over last night dies down, I think it'll have a good effect on both admissions and donations." That was cold, I thought, but that was Mike. At least he wasn't as eager-looking as I was accustomed to. That afternoon, he looked more like Richard Nixon after Watergate. "This is a short-lived excitement," Babson said. "What matters is the long-term recognition Eastern gets." He turned to me. "I want you to get as much press coverage out of this event as you can, Steve. Forget the maudlin sentimentality. Joe DeGorian would have wanted his death to serve Eastern as much as he did in life. Use it as a hook if you have to. Promise interviews, pictures, whatever you have to do to get those newspapers and magazines here. I'd like to see this in Time, Newsweek, the Wall Street Journal, for Christ's sake." I was officially creeped out at that point. It seemed like neither of them cared that a man had died the night before, a man we all knew and worked with, but I wasn't in any position to criticize either of them. "I'll do my best, sir." "And get me a report by the end of the week. Analyze the costs of the party and the positive and negative publicity you can see materializing." He stood up and stretched. "I saw that police detective in your office and the yellow tape out in the garden. Have they discovered anything else?" My English teacher background kicked in, and I considered how to phrase what I wanted to say, opting for the passive voice. "It looks like the murder weapon was found," I said. I wasn't about to say that my dog found it. "Suspects?" Babson asked. Once again, I paused. I wasn't sure how much of what I had spoken about with Tony I should be passing on to Babson and Mike, even though they were my bosses. What if one of them was Joe's murderer? "He hasn't told me." "I always go for the ex-wife in situations like this," Mike said. "Believe me, I know." He grimaced. I knew that Mike's wife had left him 2 years before for a coach at a Big Ten college, and I figured that was mostly why he suspected Nora Leadham. Or was he the killer and trying to deflect suspicion from himself? "I heard them arguing that night, and I saw her go outside," Mike continued. "I don't know the woman personally, but it seems pretty obvious. Maybe the police are too dense to see it." "I'm sure the police will interview her," I said. "Either of you need anything else from me? The phone has been ringing off the wall." Babson sat down in the chair across from Mike's desk and steepled his fingers. "No, if we need anything, we'll call you," he said to me. He turned to Mike. "I hope you're right about the positive publicity we can get out of Joe's death. I'd hate to have to kill this campaign just as it was getting started." I couldn't help shuddering every time somebody mentioned death. Poor Joe, I thought. Dead and no one to mourn him. I started to shiver out in the hallway, and when I got back to my office, I turned the heat up and swiveled my chair around, watching the French doors fog up and block my view of the distant hills. Rochester came over to sit next to me on his hind legs, so I could pet his head and scratch behind his ears. "You know anything more about who killed Joe?" I asked. He shook his head, and the metal chain around his neck clanked. Chapter 5. The Eastern Experience. When Rochester and I got to my office at 9 the next morning, there were already a half a dozen messages from reporters who wanted to get the scoop on Joe's murder. The morning paper came in, and, as I expected, Eastern College admissions director murdered at gala party made the headlines. The college had a press office which handled everything except issues related to the campaign, which fell to me. Even so, I spent the next couple of hours answering and returning calls, often from worried parents concerned for their children's safety, and working on a statement for the college about Joe's life and death. Around 11, I walked down the hall to the admissions office, where I found Sally at her desk, reading applications on her computer screen. A stack of view books teetered on the windowsill as I looked at the flag outside the building, flying at half-staff for Joe. The pile of glossy books depicting the Eastern Experience slid off the sill and scattered on the floor. "Leave 'em," Sally said. "God, do I hate view books. Every time you go to a college fair or a high school or a candidate reception, you've got to carry hundreds of them, even though everything in them is on our website. Joe insisted. And they're always heavy and slippery too, so you can drop a whole box just when you're late for a presentation and have them spill all over the linoleum in some godforsaken high school in the boondocks. Fortunately, Babson thinks they're a waste of money, so with Joe gone, this is probably our last batch." I sat down in a spindle chair with an Eastern seal on its back, picked one up and flipped through it. It was filled with glossy pictures of Eastern students studying, playing, eating, and resting on the lawn. Classrooms and teachers, local hangouts in the library, the computer room at midnight, filled with avid hackers. It was supposed to represent the sum of the Eastern Experience. You never saw an ugly student in a view book or one with pimples. You never saw students arrested for drunk driving or shots of the campus birth control clinic or the suicide hotline, even though they were all part of the Eastern Experience too. And now murder was another part. That was guaranteed not to be in the next view book. "I'm sure you'll be getting a visit from that police detective you saw in my office last night, Tony Rinaldi," I said. "I'm sure he'll want to talk to you about Joe and what's been going on in the office." "Do you think I'm a suspect?" Sally asked. I laughed. Sally was just a kid after all, barely out of college herself. I couldn't see her cutting Joe's throat. "Seriously, Steve, they always go around and ask who benefits from this death, and I guess I do, in a queer way. I'm responsible for admissions now. I met with Babson for a few minutes this morning, and he gave me his vote of confidence. Of course, they'll have to post the position and accept applicants, but he made it sound like I had the inside track." "I don't see Tony accusing you of murder just to get Joe's job," I said, standing up. "All he'd have to do is look around at all this chaos. Who'd want this job?" "You'd be surprised," Sally said as I walked out. I ran into Tony in the hallway as I returned to my office. There were shadows under his eyes, and though his khaki shirt was neatly pressed, he didn't look as ready for action as he usually did. Rochester jumped up from his place in the corner to nuzzle him as we walked in. Tony ignored him, sitting down across from me. "You look like you didn't get much sleep last night," I said. "Nope, you get a crazy little thing like a murder. It tends to keep you working long after your bedtime." He sat down across from me, laying his heavy coat and Russian wool hat on the chair next to him. "I went over all the witness statements and put together subpoenas for the victim's cell phone and email records. Not a quick process, I can tell you. How about you? You get out of here at a reasonable hour?" "Yeah, but I couldn't sleep too well. I kept thinking about Joe." "I've been trying to put together his movements last night," Tony said. "When was the last time you saw him, before you found the body?" "Halfway through President Babson's speech, about 9 o'clock. I saw him leave the ballroom. I don't know where he went." "See anyone follow him?" I shook my head. "How about the garden? You see anyone out there or anyone coming in?" "Yeah, the Rising Suns were outside before they started to sing." I did the same thing Sally had done, miming smoking dope. Rochester looked up at me and cocked his head. "Crime scene guys found a joint stubbed out," he said. "Anyone else?" I closed my eyes and thought for a minute. Nora Leadham, Joe's ex-wife. She came back inside as I was looking for Joe. I felt a momentary pang of guilt. I didn't want to be the one who sent Nora to the electric chair. She'd always been nice to me, but if she was Joe's killer, she had to be brought to justice. I know she and Joe have had some spectacular arguments. Any idea what those arguments were about? I shook my head. When I worked in his office, sometimes I'd hear one side of a conversation, Joe yelling at her about some trivial thing like putting out the garbage. By the time I got back here, they were already divorced. They were always nice to each other in public, but I know he still felt bitter about her. What time did you see her? Just before I found the body. I was talking to her when I saw Rochester run by. When he heard his name, Rochester got up and came over to me. I picked up his rawhide bone from the floor and stuck it in his mouth, and he settled down to chew. Wasn't it strange for her to go outside like that? It was pretty cold last night. She smokes, I said. Cigarettes. I often see her sneaking outside between her classes. And I did mention it to her. She said something about being from Vermont, how the cold didn't bother her. Tony looked up from his notepad. Let's go back to the deceased. Tell me what you know about him. I've known Joe for years. He had just started in the admissions office when I was a high school senior, applying to colleges. I was in the first class he admitted, and I worked in his office for a year when I was an undergrad. When I came back to teach here last year, Joe was one of the people who was nicest to me. The phone rang. Excuse me. Into the phone, I said. We don't have an official statement yet, but all statements to the press have gone through my office, or the college press bureau. I gave the reporter directions to the campus and the name of the guy in the press bureau. Then I turned back to Tony. Sorry, where was I? Oh, I was teaching as an adjunct last fall in the English department, and I used to have coffee with Joe now and then. He was the one who told me about this job, and he gave me a good recommendation when I applied. I really owed him. Rochester chewed noisily on his rawhide, only stopping when I stood up. The phone's not going to shut up. You want to take a walk with me in Rochester? I have a few things I should tell you, and it would probably be best to say them out of the office. Sure. I grabbed Rochester's leash and put on my coat, and he shrugged back into his coat, positioning his astrakhan hat precisely on his head. Then the three of us walked out the French doors to the garden behind Fields Hall. Joe was a guy with a big personality, very set in his ways. There are a couple of people around here who might have had a motive to kill him. Who? In the admissions office, you're bound to make enemies. We can only accept 1 out of every 7 applicants, and if my kid didn't get in, I might get pissed off. You should talk to a guy named Bob Moran, one of our alums. Joe rejected his son, even though Moran was willing to give us $100,000 towards the capital campaign. Bob Moran, the electric car guy? Bob had been on TV a lot over the past few months, advertising his cars and how far you could drive them on a single charge. He'd had himself filmed driving along the Delaware and going in circles around Layville, and was talking about a cross-country trip. Yeah, that's him. He was at the party last night, and I know he was angry at Joe. Tony scrawled some notes while Rochester sniffed and peed. Joe was stubborn and old-fashioned, and he didn't like change, I continued. He was always the one who stood up and complained about new technology in the classroom, cutting down on the language requirement, all the kinds of things only academics care about. He argued with a lot of faculty and administrators who were here last night, too. Can you think of anyone who might have been at the party who didn't like him? Anyone he had a particular beef with? I hesitated. Mike had been good to me, letting me bring Rochester to the office and supporting me when I argued with Joe himself. My boss, I said. Mike McCormick. This campaign is all his idea, and Joe was very opposed to it. Joe thought the money we were spending on the party last night could better have been used for scholarships, and he resented the influence Mike has over President Babson. You see if Mike went out to the garden last night? I shook my head. I was running around a lot, talking to reporters, helping Sally look for Joe, keeping an eye out for problems. I assume Mike was working the room, talking to potential donors, but I don't remember seeing him any time after the introductions. The three of us walked around the corner of Fields Hall, and acres of Pennsylvania countryside stretched before us. In the far distance I could see a thin band of the Delaware River. Allentown and Easton lay to the north, Philadelphia to the south, and Trenton somewhere to the southeast, across the river in New Jersey. Rochester kept pulling on his leash like he had urgent business to do, and I was getting tired of having my arm pulled out of my socket. "Don't tell anyone you saw me do this," I said to Tony. I reached down and let Rochester off his leash. "Go run, boy." "You realize I'm an officer of the law. There's a leash law in Layville." "Dogs aren't even allowed on the eastern campus. Rochester is an exception." "I'll say, but tell me some more about how DeGorian fits into the college administration. Anyone else around who might resent him?" I contemplated Rinaldi's question as I stared out at the sweet pastoral countryside, undamaged as yet by the encroachments of suburbia and civilization. Rochester had his nose to the ground like a bloodhound, sniffing a trail around the garden. "President Babson sets all the policy around here, and he's both the chief academic and administrative officer. Joe had a set way of doing things. He wasn't very flexible, and he was mad that we were spending so much money on fundraising and public relations. He and Babson used to be good friends, but lately they've been at loggerheads, though not about Joe's office. So far, we've been getting more and more good applicants, and the college can continue to be picky about who we admit." Rinaldi took a couple more notes. "You know, I don't think very many people like Joe, but I can't think of anyone who hated him enough to kill him either. For the most part, his life was centered around Eastern. He wasn't the kind of guy who inspired a lot of passion." "Yeah, and when you read the newspaper, it's always the honor student who is kind to little old ladies that gets killed," Tony said. "But when you get right down to it, somebody offed him for some reason." I wondered about that. Did Joe have hidden secrets? Was there something none of us knew about that had caused his death? Was his murder a random act? Or was he simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Rochester disappeared around the corner of the building, heading towards the ballroom. "Come back here, you dumb dog," I called, hurrying after him. I didn't want campus security to see him off the leash, or him to dart back into the building without me. "This is why dogs should be on leashes," Tony said, following me. I rounded the corner and saw Rochester still on the trail, his nose to the ground. "What are you doing, you wackadoodle?" I asked. "You're a retriever, not a bloodhound." He ignored me and kept sniffing, right up to the base of a pine tree. He looked up at me and barked once, then started digging in the dirt beneath the tree. "Rochester," I said, rushing toward him. "Stop that! You'll get the groundskeepers after us." Tony followed me over to where he was digging. When we reached him, I grabbed his collar and attached his leash. He stepped back, then looked up at me, then Tony, and barked again. We looked down at where he had been digging. The handle of what looked like a kitchen knife protruded from the dirt. Chapter 7. Owing Joe. Dijon came into my office a few minutes later. "I've got a class at 2, she said. "I left your messages on your desk." "Thanks, Dijon." I returned a couple of calls, then wrote a statement that regretted Joe's death, but gave most emphasis to the capital campaign. What the hell, I thought. Joe would have wanted it that way. He was that devoted to Eastern. It was hard to concentrate because so many calls came in, many from newspapers I'd never heard of. I kept thinking about Joe getting killed and worrying about what Tony would uncover. I knew there were secrets all around the college, and if too many of them came to light, it would make my job a lot harder. I was just printing the release when Nora Leadham appeared in my office door. Rochester jumped up and rushed toward her. She was obviously upset. Her hair had fallen out of its bun, and gray-brown strands fell loosely across her face. Her eyes were red and puffy, but she managed to smile as she reached down to pat Rochester. "You have such good light here," she said, looking around. "A poet needs good light. At least I do. I can't write a thing when it's dark and gloomy." She didn't strike me as a woman who needed airiness and light in order to write. She was a strong, no-nonsense sort of woman, and if I didn't know her, I'd expect her to dismiss poetry with a wave of one calloused hand. She was about 5'6", slim and athletic, with short brown hair going to gray and cut severely just below her chin line. She had well-chiseled features and a piercing gaze. "I've just been interrogated. The police think I've killed him," she said, standing in the doorway. "But I didn't. You believe me, don't you, Steve?" I didn't know what to say. I hardly knew Nora. She had been a colleague when I was an adjunct in the English department, but we'd only talked about literature and student writing skills. I wouldn't consider myself her friend. "Come on in, Nora. Can I get you something? Coffee? Tea?" I made an executive decision. "We have a great cappuccino machine in the kitchen. Why don't I make us a couple of mochas?" "That would be nice." She followed me to the kitchen and sat down at the table. Rochester sat on his haunches next to her, and she stroked his golden head as I bustled around the kitchen. "I'm angry," she said. "I'm not angry that they suspect me. I'm angry that they'll stop looking for the real killer until long after I go on trial, and they realize they've made a mistake. By then they'll have no chance to find out who killed Joe, and I want them to." "Why do you think they suspect you, Nora?" I poured coffee into 2 mugs with the Eastern College seal and motto and nodded. "It's obvious, isn't it? As Joe's ex-wife, I'm the most likely person to have had a grudge against him." I flashed back to Mary. Did she hate me, or had she already relegated me to her past? "Did you have one?" I asked. She shook her head. "We fought, not as much as we used to when we were married, but we just couldn't change those old patterns. To make life less awkward, Joe and I tried to get along, but it seemed like every time we got together we argued. Even last night, we fought. I'm thinking of going out west. I have an offer to teach and run a writing program in Nevada. Joe couldn't believe I wanted to leave Eastern. It was as bad as when I asked him for a divorce." "You were arguing last night?" I asked. "Outside?" She nodded. "I slipped out for a cigarette and ran into Joe. He used to smoke too, you know. But then he stopped, and every time he caught me smoking, he started in on me. I got so frustrated with him. I said some foolish things, and apparently that police detective found out about them." I stirred in some chocolate syrup with one hand as I foamed the milk with the other. While the machine buzzed, I wondered what it would be like to see Mary again, to know where she lived, to pass her at the grocery or while I was out walking Rochester, but that kind of thinking was useless. "Let me guess," I said. "You threatened to kill him." "More or less. I think I actually said something like, 'Sometimes you frustrate me so much I could just kill you, Joe DeGorian.' But of course I didn't mean it. I promised to go over to the house after the party was over so he could tell me why he needed me around to support him." I found a can of whipped cream in the refrigerator and topped the mochas, then handed hers to her. "Nora, who do you think killed Joe?" "I don't know, Steve. I just don't know. He was a good man at heart, and I loved him once. But when I took back my name, I took back my heart, and that was 6 years ago. Joe never understood me, and he never understood why we divorced. I can imagine that he misunderstood someone else, and that's what led to his death." "Someone at the college?" She reached down and scratched behind Rochester's ears, and he yawned, stretching his mouth open and showing his rows of white teeth. "I can't say, although you know, as I do, that Joe didn't have much of a life beyond Eastern College. If he had, maybe he would have let me go a little easier. It's awful to say, but his death has freed me from a terrible burden. I can go to Nevada now, or I can stay here in Layville without him watching me and provoking me. It's a wonderful sense of freedom." "He wasn't your husband anymore, Nora," I said. "When 2 people are married for as long as Joe and I were, you have a history between you that doesn't dissolve with the legal decree. Joe depended on me, and I still cared for him enough to listen to him sometimes. I knew that he was desperate that I stay around Layville, but he wouldn't tell me why. He just kept saying he would need me soon, and that I had to be there for him." "Did you see or hear anyone else while you were outside?" "I can't really remember. I know it was very quiet. The only people I saw were 2 older women waiting to go into the party. They must have heard me arguing with Joe." Probably repeated it word for word to the police." I retrieved a carton of biscotti from the cabinet and sat down across from Nora. "What do you think I can do for you?" I broke off a piece of biscotti and fed it to Rochester. "You're friendly with that police detective, Rinaldi. Can you talk to him for me? Tell him I didn't do it?" "We're not friends, just acquaintances. And honestly, Nora, I don't have any influence over him." I shook my head. "But someone else spoke to Joe after you did. That person killed him. We just have to trust Tony to find that person." I sipped my cafe mocha. It wasn't quite as good as I could have gotten at a cafe, but it was all right. "Can you think of anyone who might have held a grudge against Joe?" She shook her head. "I sat up most of the night thinking, and I can't come up with anyone. But you know, Joe saved everything. Maybe if you looked through his files, you could come up with something. I can do that. I'll get Sally Marston to help, I said. I walked Nora back to the front door of Fields Hall, Rochester by my side. I'll do what I can, Nora. I want to find out what happened to Joe. You know he was a mentor to me. Thank you, Steve. She leaned down and scratched behind Rochester's ears. And you take care of this good boy here. No worries about that. Rochester knows who's in charge around here, and that character has 4 paws and a tail. Chapter 8. The Crackpot Files. I took Rochester back to my office and left him there, then walked to Sally's office, which was empty. I found her down the hall in Joe's old office, one of the largest in Fields Hall, with French doors like the ones in my office, and a sweeping view over the front of the campus. Downhill, I could see the massive iron gates that marked the entrance to Eastern. To the right and left were classroom buildings in gray and brown fieldstone. A few students crossed the campus, bundled against the cold. I was just talking to Nora Leadham, I said. She says the police think she killed Joe. I can't believe that. She's such a nice person, and she's a vegan. Like vegans never commit murder, I said. Anyway, she suggested I look through Joe's files and see if I can come up with any other suspects. I was hoping you might have some free time to help. Joe saved every letter ever written to him, Sally said dryly. I'm sure we can turn up a few crackpots with a motive for murder. She stood up and crossed the room to a file cabinet against the back wall. It's creepy to be in here when he hasn't even been buried yet, but I need to access all his files and I can't keep running back and forth. She began pulling folders out of the drawer. Wow, this whole drawer is filled with angry letters. I didn't know there were so many. She began ferrying file folders to the credenza next to her desk. I picked up the first one and looked at the dates. This is my class, I said. The files go that far back? Sally giggled. Sorry, I didn't mean that the way it came out. I know, I'm a dinosaur. I'm 43. So that means Joe was in the admissions office just over 25 years. I'm 25. That means he started working here the year I was born. And he was making trouble even back then, I said. Look at all this stuff. In 1985, they were still using carbon paper at Eastern, and a lot of the letters in the files were on flimsy paper, letters smudged, still smelling faintly of musty ink. Joe had saved copies of rejection letters that had received negative responses, and it was sad to see how many people hadn't had the opportunity I had to get an Eastern education. It makes you wonder what happened to all these people, Sally said. Did they go on to college somewhere else? Are they happy? Hope so. It must be a big responsibility, deciding who gets into Eastern and who doesn't. You can make or break someone's whole life. It's not quite that dramatic. Admissions is a very subjective process. Someone who doesn't get into Eastern might still get into another very good college. And even if they don't, there's always Penn State. I know a lot of people who got great educations there. We worked through the files, pulling out any letters that seemed threatening. As the pile grew, I turned to the computer and started doing some research, beginning with a couple of the business networking sites. I put aside anyone I could find online who looked like they had a degree from somewhere else and a successful career. It took us a couple of hours, and my back was sore and creaky by the time we finished. Most of the files we still had open were from more recent years, as you'd expect. Those applicants were harder to track down, and it was likely their grudges were freshest. We ended up with close to 24 names. The most troubling was a guy who had applied to my own class, named Thomas Taylor. His application, transcripts, and recommendations were bundled into a large manila folder. Taylor's record at Allentown Regional High School was a little above average. His test scores were acceptable, and his recommendations lukewarm. There was nothing on the surface to indicate either acceptance or rejection. He was one of those borderline candidates whose decision rests on unquantifiables, like extracurricular activities or a personal interview. A short note in Joe's handwriting on a half sheet of Eastern letterhead brought it all together. It was headed, Taylor, Thomas, and read, very enthusiastic about Eastern, though seemed somewhat unbalanced, potentially unstable. Check further with references. I could find no mention of what further checking might have brought, other than the red stamp, reject, in the upper right-hand corner of the envelope. The letters began in late May of 1985 and continued periodically through 1990. Apparently, Thomas Taylor had applied only to Eastern and, when rejected, had entered the Army. Several of the letters remained in their original envelopes and showed a military return address. The letters blamed everything that had happened to Taylor after his rejection from Eastern on Joe. He had been beaten down in boot camp, made fun of by his fellow soldiers, had numerous run-ins with authorities, and eventually was dishonorably discharged. "Phew," I said, looking up from the letter describing his discharge. "That's a powerful motive." "Wait, Steve, there's more," Sally said. "No letters from 1990 to 2000, but then they start again, sporadically, one every couple of years. The last one came in just last month." "Where's that one postmarked from?" "Southeastern Pennsylvania. Isn't it helpful that the post office switched to that system? It could be from anywhere in 4 counties. No return address, of course." "Of course." I stared out the window at the rooftops of Layville. "He could be here in town, you know. Those letters make it seem like Taylor blamed everything that happened to him since 1985 on Joe. That gives him a big motive for murder." "He's nuts, the poor guy. I'll bet he never got to college after all." It made me wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't gotten into Eastern? Would I have gone off the rails like Thomas Taylor, ended up writing crackpot letters to Joe DeGorian? "We should see if any of the names from Joe's files show up on the guest list for last night," I said. "But we'll have to do that tomorrow. I need to get Rochester home for his dinner, and I need to call Tony Rinaldi and give him the list of rejects with grudges." When I got back to my office, I discovered that Rochester had made a mess of my desk. The guest list for the party had been strewn across the floor, and he was lying beside my office chair with one piece of paper under his paw. "Rochester, what did you do?" It wasn't his fault, of course. I shouldn't have left him alone in the office for such a long time. I leaned down and picked up the page, tugging it out from under him. Looking down, I saw it was the page that ran from K to N. A big chunk of doggy drool sat right in the middle, next to Bob Moran's name. I looked at Rochester. "Are you trying to tell me something?" In the past, Rochester had demonstrated an uncanny ability to point me toward clues. Was he telling me something about Bob Moran? But I realized that Nora Leadham's name was on the list too, and so was Sally Marston's and Mike McCormick's, as well as about 50 other people. Maybe he was just annoyed that I had left him behind? It was too much to think about. I knew I needed to call Tony Rinaldi, but I couldn't face any more thoughts about death. I grabbed my briefcase and Rochester's leash and said, "Come on, boy, let's go home." At least I understood his response to that pretty clearly. Chapter 9. Little Gray Cells. I stopped at Gennardi's and picked up a couple of sandwiches, one for Rochester and one for me, and we went home. I hid a couple of vitamin pills in the bread and watched him scarf them down, then ate my own meal sitting in front of the TV, with Rochester sprawled next to me on the floor. I couldn't concentrate on the TV. I kept thinking back to Joe DeGorian, wondering who could have killed him. Finally, I got up and moved to the kitchen table, where I pulled a pad and pen out of my briefcase. Hercule Poirot would have considered who had a motive to kill Joe, I thought, so I started listing suspects. Tony Rinaldi had his eye on Nora Leadham. Ex-wives were always good suspects. I knew that if I was ever murdered, my ex would be on top of the list. And I knew from our conversation that afternoon that Joe had been trying to keep Nora from leaving Layville. And who knew what other issues they had between them? Joe wasn't an easy guy to work with, so I figured he'd been even worse to live with. Thinking of who Joe worked with brought me to Sally Marston. She was bright and enthusiastic, with lots of new ideas about college admissions, but Joe had kept her on a tight leash, not giving her the chance to experiment, and with him gone, she had stepped into his job. She seemed to have an alibi, though. The first thing she'd done, I knew, was offer a place in Eastern's next class to Bob Moran's son, Marty. Could Moran have killed Joe? College admission seemed like such a minor thing, yet I knew from experience that it meant a lot to many people. It could make or break a kid's future, and for someone like Bob Moran, who had such a personal connection to Eastern, having his son rejected must have been hard to take. Was it enough to kill Joe over, though? Joe had argued with Mike McCormick, too. Joe thought the capital campaign was too big, too wasteful, and doomed to fail. He tried to stonewall Mike wherever he could, arguing over every detail of the campaign. Could Mike have finally had too much of Joe's interference? Another person Joe interfered with was President Babson. He and Joe often clashed over policies, and though Babson was in charge, Joe was so entrenched he couldn't be fired easily. I knew Babson was a megalomaniac and easily conflated himself with Eastern, but could he be off the charts enough to commit murder? "There are still so many suspects," I said to Rochester. "I don't understand how Hercule Poirot does it." He didn't respond. Finally, I dragged myself up from the table, took him out for a quick walk, then went up to bed. Exhausted from my lack of sleep the night before, I dozed off to the sounds of the house settling, the rattles and creaks and pinging pipes that I'd come to associate with my feelings of home ownership. The next day was cold and clear, and Rochester took way too long on our morning walk around River Bend. "Come on, dog, I've got stuff to do," I said. But he wouldn't pick up the pace, preferring to mosey along with his nose to the ground like a bloodhound. I pulled out my cell phone and called Tony Rinaldi. "I've got some stuff for you," I said. "Can you come by my office sometime?" "How about around lunchtime? We could eat at one of those phenomenal lunch trucks you've got up at the college." A flotilla of lunch trucks were usually parked out on Main Street just beyond the college gates. When I was an undergrad, they had specialized in the kind of greasy foods college kids love to eat: under-cheesed pizza that melts through thin paper plates, overcooked hamburgers disintegrating day-old buns, French fries encrusted with salt, and hot dogs made with every variety of meat substitute known to man. Nowadays, a kebab truck had joined in, as well as a vegan offering, but the quality was pretty much the same as it always had been. "I'm sensing some sarcasm in your voice," I said. "Sadly, the lunch trucks go on vacation whenever the students do. Neither the trucks nor the students will be back until Monday." "Fine, I'll meet you at the Hungry Horse at noon." I hung up. The Hungry Horse was only one step up from the lunch trucks, a venerable institution that hadn't changed its menu, except to update prices, or its decor since I was a student. Rochester's bladder was finally empty, and we returned home. Within a half hour, we were back up at the college. I spent a couple of hours sending out press kits, answering phone calls and trying to tell people that Joe's murder had nothing to do with Eastern. Then I went over each newspaper article about the past evening's events, highlighting the good things that were said about the college. And then, because I couldn't resist, I went over my own movements again and again and tried to reconstruct Joe's. I even drew a diagram of Fields Hall and tracked my movements against his. Around 11 o'clock, Sally came into my office. "I've been thinking," she said. "What do you think Joe was doing outside? He might have gone to meet someone, but I know he also got claustrophobic sometimes, and he might have gone outside just to get some fresh air." "And the killer followed him." I pulled out the guest list. "I was thinking we could cross-reference this list to the rejected applicants." Sally read the names we had found off to me, but there wasn't a single match. "So much for that idea," she said. She looked at me. "Do you think we could have done anything at the party to protect Joe? Put a guard in the garden, made people walk through a metal detector?" "I don't think anything could have saved Joe," I said. "But you never know when something else is going to happen. We ought to have more security guards and better locks on the doors and more prevention lectures to the students. Eastern College was just a disaster waiting to happen." Sally pushed back from my desk. "I really have to get back to my own work. I'm totally swamped, and without another professional in the office, I don't know how I can manage." "I thought you had 4 kids helping you." "I do. Ike Karumba is my superstar. He knows every high school in the mountain and plains regions, and he puts in about 20 hours a week interviewing, too. He's been terrific since Joe died, but something strange is going on. I always thought Joe and Ike got along really well until about a week before Joe died, when Ike backed out of a couple of appointments and told me he couldn't be around as much anymore. Up until then, I thought he was angling for my job. He was always Joe's favorite." She sighed. "But I finally went through my inbox yesterday and I found a draft of a letter from Joe to Babson recommending that Ike be disciplined and possibly expelled from Eastern." "Really? Why?" "It's unclear. Something about violating the ethics of the admissions office, taking advantage of his position. Similar high-flown and meaningless language. All I can find is references to a letter from a girl we admitted last year named Verona Santander. She eventually went to Barnard. A good school. Oh, I can't argue that, considering I went there, Sally said. But I'd love to know what she has against Ike. Her file says nothing. Ike interviewed her in Oregon last fall and gave her an excellent rating. I have a trip planned to New York this weekend, I said. I'm meeting with some alumni and press contacts. If you'd like, I can give her a call. Would you, Steve? That'd be great. I'm so swamped I haven't got the time to do it myself, and I'm afraid to find out anyway. Ike is really my best and most experienced interviewer, and I'd hate to lose him now when I'm so busy. I was kind of hoping he'd agree to work even more hours and eventually accept a full-time position after graduation. I'll let you know when I go, I said. My cell phone alarm played a marimba beat to remind me of my lunch date with Tony Rinaldi. I'm going to meet Tony now, I said to Sally. Maybe later we can brainstorm more about the guest list. I stood up and Rochester jumped up too. Sorry, bud, but I can't take you with me, I said to him. I promised to bring you a treat, though. He looked up and cocked his head at me. I scratched behind his ears and walked out to where Dijon sat, wearing an Eastern College sweatshirt and poring over a chemistry text. I'm going to lunch. Can you stay until I get back? Sure. You need me to walk Rochester? He heard his name and trailed out behind me, sprawling next to Dijon's chair. She smiled and petted him. If you want to take him out for a few minutes, that would be great. I walked down the hill to Main Street. Only a few fair-weather cumulus clouds marred an otherwise empty blue sky. A breeze nipped at my cheeks and made me draw my scarf tighter around my neck. When I got to the Hungry Horse, Rinaldi was already in a booth by the front window, looking glum. What's the matter? I asked. Look at the menu? It's not like we get a homicide every day around here. It's a hell of a lot of work trying to figure this all out, driving me nuts. The server was Filet, a morose teen from somewhere in Eastern Europe who'd been in the same mystery fiction class as Dijon. Welcome to the Hungry Horse. How may I serve you today? He said. Filet? It's me, Professor Levitan, from last year. He looked at me. And? Tony snickered across the table from me. And I'll have an onion soup and a cheeseburger medium, I said. Lettuce, tomato, mayonnaise, fries. He scribbled something on his pad. Tony said, Make that 2 soups and 2 burgers, with extra onion rings on mine. When Filet had gone back to the kitchen, probably to commiserate with the chef over actually having to work, Tony said, You have something for me? I opened my briefcase and pulled out the copies Sally had made of Thomas Taylor's file, along with the information on the other rejected applicants. Filet returned with a confused look on his face. Do you want something to drink? Water, we both said. I couldn't tell if he was trying to interfere with our conversation or if he was just the most inefficient waiter on the planet. Every time Tony and I started to talk, Filet was there. He brought one set of silverware, then returned a moment later with a second. He brought both the waters at the same time, but then he delivered a bottle of ketchup, then soon after a jar of mustard. If you say anything to him, he's going to spit in our food, Tony said during one of our brief interludes without Filet lurking beside us. Can you arrest him for something after he brings the food? Incompetence is not a criminal offense, he said. If it was, your faculty would have us up at the college every other day. I guess you're right. In between Filet's interruptions, we went over all the files I had brought. I'll check them out, Tony said. But right now we're looking closer at home. Filet delivered our soup, and we started to eat. Maybe I was hungry, or the cold weather had done something to my taste buds, but the soup was pretty good. By closer to home, what do you mean? I asked. Nora Leadham? Can't say. Then why did you? Just to tease and torment me? You're not going to go all Nancy Drew on me again, are you? He asked. Sticking your nose into my investigation? I pushed back from the table. I just gave you some good information. I don't consider that sticking my nose in your investigation. You and your dog, he said. Neither of you can resist a good scent. Filet looked interested in that comment as he swapped our empty soup bowls for the cheeseburger platters. Nora Leadham came to my office yesterday. She thinks you've got it in for her. I don't have it in for anyone, Tony said, between bites. I'm just investigating, but the case just seems to get worse against Mrs. Leadham. We've learned about a pending deal between her and the deceased. The details aren't clear yet, but some land in New Hampshire was about to be sold. As the deal stood, she got 50% of the profit, but according to his will, if he died before the land was sold, his interest went to her. I don't think Nora would have killed Joe for a couple of house lots. I bit into my cheeseburger, and despite the dingy surroundings and our morose waiter, it was terrific. Not a couple of lots, Tony said. Enough for a whole subdivision, several $100,000. My mind jumped back to the conversation I'd had with Nora about the freedom Joe's death had given her. Not just emotional freedom, I thought, but financial freedom as well. I shook the thought out of my head. What about Bob Moran? I asked, and I couldn't help remembering the way the Rising Suns had riffed off his name in song. Did you check him out? Steve, you need to leave the investigating to me. I appreciate the help, but it's time for you to pack your dog up and go home. Uh-huh. I noticed that he didn't answer my question and wondered why. Bob Moran was a wealthy, influential businessman in Layville, and I could see that Tony wouldn't want to ruffle his feathers. Say, I was talking to your friend Rick Stemper the other day, Tony said. I noticed the change in direction, but didn't remark on it. I need to call him myself. I've been so swamped with this new job I haven't been doing much besides go to work and take care of Rochester. See, here's an opportunity. Go hang out with Rick, complain about your ex-wives, and forget about snooping in my case. Yeah. We talked for a while about Rick, how unseasonably cold the winter was, and a few other things too mundane to mention. I stopped at the deli down the block from the Hungry Horse and picked up some sausage for Rochester, then hunkered down into my coat and scarf. As I walked back up the hill, I wondered about Tony's comment about Rick's and my ex-wives. True, Rick and I had bonded again, years after we'd known each other in high school, over our shared angst after divorce. But did that reference mean Tony was stuck on Joe's ex-wife as his murderer? And had Nora really done it? Chapter 10. Unexpected Visitors. When I got back to my office, I focused on putting together a report detailing the party expenses, bills from the caterers, from the supply house that rented us the chairs, overtime for the security guards and the maintenance people, and a host of other charges. Everything had to be cost-coded, calculated, cross-referenced, and tied up with a ribbon of red tape. By mid-afternoon, I needed a caffeine boost. I was on my way back from the kitchen with a big mug of coffee when I ran into Nora Leadham. "Have you heard anything from that police sergeant?" she asked. "Let's go into my office." I ushered her inside, and Rochester gave her a brief woof. "I'm afraid it looks bad, Nora," I said, closing the door behind me. "The police have found out about a land deal you and Joe had going on in New Hampshire." "Not that," Nora said. "When Joe and I were married, my parents gave us 100 acres of land. We always thought we'd retire there someday. A year ago, some real estate speculators approached Joe and asked him to sell the land so that they could build houses on it. When he came to me, I told him I wouldn't sell my interest in it." "It's a lot of money." "It's not the money. The land has been in my family for generations, and I always thought I would pass it on to my children, if I had any. But I didn't, and now I'm not sure what I'll do with it, but I won't sell it. Have you seen suburban subdivisions lately? Awful look-alike houses on cul-de-sacs with silly names. They're soulless, and I won't have any part of one." She crossed her arms in front of her. "Joe told me last month he was going to force a sale of the property because he wanted to retire early. He'd get his pension, of course, but he needed the money as a cushion. He seemed to feel he would be leaving Eastern soon." "I wonder why. I thought he loved this place." "I think he was tired of fighting to have things his own way. Before John Babson became president, he and Joe were very close. John got caught up in this campaign of his, and Joe became more determined to keep things the way they were." "Why did you stay here in Layville after your divorce?" I asked. "Why not make a clean break back then?" "I was already an adjunct assistant professor at Eastern by the time the divorce was final, and there weren't many opportunities like that around for 40-year-old novices. And Joe needed me around. I did his laundry, and he fixed things around my apartment, and we had dinner together once or twice a week. It was my life." She leaned back in her chair, and Rochester put his head in her lap. And to think, he used to only do that for me. Traitor. Only this past September, when I got the opportunity to go to Nevada, did I feel like I had any real choice. As a feminist, I believe women have as many choices as men do, but I started my career too late. You can do anything while you're young, but as you get older, your age and your own growing desire for security and routine defeat you. She stood up. I'll let you get back to your work. If you hear anything, will you let me know? I'll do what I can. After she left, I wondered again if she had a motive to kill Joe. She said she didn't want to sell that property, didn't need the money, but $100,000 could cushion her transition to Nevada, as well as helping her with eventual retirement. I remembered how tough it had been for me, relocating to Stewart's Crossing after I'd got out of prison, with nothing to my name beyond the deed to a townhouse my father had left me. I forced myself to go back to my report, and by 4 o'clock I had a real handle on all the bills and charges. As I was starting to enter them into a spreadsheet, I heard a knock on my office door. "This a good time for a drop-in visit?" Santiago Santos asked. Santos was my parole officer, a Puerto Rican with a bachelor's degree in sociology from Drexel. He looked like an amateur boxer, about 5'8", stocky, with muscular forearms. I wasn't sure which of those characteristics helped him most in dealing with his clients. As usual, when I saw him, my heart rate accelerated. If he wasn't happy with the way things were going for me, he had the power to rescind my parole and send me back to California to serve out the rest of my sentence. So far, he hadn't shown an inclination to do that. He had been strict with me, but fair. "Sure, come on in," I said. Rochester looked up from his place on the floor, but didn't get up. "I see you're using a computer," Santos said, sitting down across from me. "Within your limits, right?" When I first returned to Pennsylvania and began working with him, he had installed a keystroke monitoring program on my personal laptop to be sure I wasn't doing any more of the hacking that had gotten me into trouble. This new job had presented me with a problem, though. A big component of the job description was working with databases, which had been one of my specialties before I went to prison. Mike McCormick knew what I could do and wanted me to work with our alumni records, improving the data, adding fields, and making it more easily searchable. Santos didn't know about that. I began the job right after the new year, and I dodged appointments with him since then, pleading the pressure of the campaign launch. "Tell me about this new job," Santos said, leaning back in his chair. "What exactly are your responsibilities?" "Primarily press relations and publicity for the Capitol campaign. I helped Mike McCormick, he's my boss, put on the launch party on Tuesday night." "This a full-time job?" I nodded. "Short term right now. Both of us made a commitment that I'll stay through this term, which ends in May. If the Capitol campaign works out and I can show that I'm contributing, I'm hoping it can segue into a longer-term job." "Good for you. What happens when this fundraising push finishes?" "It's a 5-year campaign. I'm not looking any farther ahead than that right now." He opened his notebook and flipped through it. "You're on a 3-year parole," he said. "Looks like you're about halfway through that period. You've done a good job, Steve. You've reintegrated into society, found yourself a solid position. I see only bright things in your future." I smiled. "Good." "With one warning. You've gotten into trouble with computers in the past, with straying into places and doing things you shouldn't. What's your access like to the college computer systems?" My heart skipped a beat or two. "I have access to all the regular systems, email, the employee intranet, shared drives, and we have our own databases in this department, alumni, donors, giving records." "Does your boss know about your background?" "Yup, I told him everything. He doesn't know much about databases, so he wants me to be able to pull data and reports for him." Santos shook his head. "That doesn't sound good, Steve. I'm nervous about you having that kind of access." "I wouldn't have this job if I didn't have those skills," I said. "It's a tough economy, you know that. There are a lot of people with more experience in fundraising and public relations than I have, but my ability to write, coupled with my database background, got me the job. I can't go to my boss now and say I can't do what he hired me to." He closed his notebook. "I want to meet with you again in 2 weeks. I can see I'm going to have to keep a close eye on you for a while." I wanted to ask if he didn't have any other more dangerous clients, people he had to keep from sticking up liquor stores or raping old ladies. But I kept my mouth shut, a rarity for me, because I knew I would only put myself in worse trouble if I didn't go along. There was no way I was going back to California or to prison. Santos left, and I sat back in my chair, hoping to coast through the rest of a Friday afternoon. Unfortunately, the press weren't coasting, and I was swamped with phone calls. Just before 5, Rochester looked up at the doorway of my office and barked once. No one there. "What, boy? You ready to go home?" He barked again. "All right, let me just shut things down here." I was fiddling with the computer when he barked a third time. "Look, dog, I'm working as fast as I can here." "I'm assuming you're calling me dog as a form of brotherly affection?" I looked up. Rick Stemper was standing in the doorway, and Rochester had jumped up to rush him. "I just can't seem to get away from law enforcement today," I said. "First Tony Rinaldi, then Santiago Santos, and now Stewart's Crossing's finest." Rick and I had grown up together in Stewart's Crossing, though we hadn't been more than acquaintances. When I returned home, we met up again, and as Tony Rinaldi had noted, Rick and I had bonded over our shared experience of divorce. It was at his request that I'd begun taking care of Rochester, and he had become my closest friend in town. "What brings you upriver?" I asked. He squatted on the floor to rub behind Rochester's ears. "Had to interview a witness who lives up here. Thought maybe I could convince you to hit a happy hour with me. Only place around here that'll let Rochester in is Edgar's Emporium. You want to head over there?" "Sure." Rochester kept nosing against Rick's pocket. "All right, you get a treat," he said, pulling out a bone-shaped biscuit. "You carrying dog biscuits now?" I asked as I shrugged into my coat. "Knew the witness had a white lab. Figured I'd make a friend that way." "Come on, you're carrying those for Rascal. You know it." Rick had adopted a black and white Australian Shepherd from the Bucks County Animal Shelter in Lahaska. "How's he working out?" "He's a wild dog. He tore up one of my sofa pillows yesterday and crapped duck feathers all over the living room." "I told you, you got to get him a crate." "He was in a cage at the shelter. I'm not caging him up at home." "Don't think of it as a cage," I said. "Think of it like his little house. Rochester still likes to stay in his, even when we're both home." "I'll think about it." He stood up. "Come on, let's go. I hear a beer calling my name." Edgar's was an old-time drinking saloon in a mall a few miles outside of Layville. It was a nationwide franchise, but it tried to appear individual by using old road signs, Victorian engravings, and mock Tiffany lamps. My father would have called it early American barn decorating. The hostess led us to a booth in the back. Rochester climbed up onto the wooden bench and curled in the corner. Rick and I ordered a pitcher of Youngling and a platter of nachos. "So you're messing around with dead bodies again, I hear," Rick said. "Not exactly. It's all Rochester's fault." I told him about Rochester discovering Joe's body and then the bloody knife the next day. "He's up to his old tricks, that's for sure." The waitress brought the nachos and the beer, and I fed Rochester a chip with beef and salsa. He wolfed it down greedily. "Who do you think did it?" Rick asked. "I have no idea. He has an ex-wife." "Bingo!" Rick interrupted me. "There you go. She did it." "Come on, Rick. Aren't you over Sheila yet?" "Sheila? She's yesterday's garbage. Already in the landfill. But that doesn't mean she's not an evil, conniving bitch." "Okay," I said. "Moving on. How's Rascal?" "He's a wild man. Mrs. Kaufman down the street has a bunch of chickens in her backyard, and Rascal keeps trying to herd them into the hen house." "Why don't we take the dogs out for a run this weekend?" Rochester looked up. "We could go up to Bowman's Hill and hike up to the tower. The dogs would love that." I fed Rochester another nacho chip. "Sounds like a plan." Rick shook his head. "You know, we're both crazy. We treat these dogs like kings. It's like we live in the kingdom of dog." "And your point is?" He shrugged. "No point, just making a statement." "What's new with you?" I asked. "Finally caught the guy who's been robbing houses up in River Heights. 16-year-old kid from Levittown. I got a chance to use that stuff I learned at the FBI seminar a couple weeks ago." "Which was?" "They call it RPM, rationalization, projection, and minimization. You make moral and psychological excuses for the suspect's actions, not legal ones. so they're still accountable for what they did. He drank some beer. I started with the rationalization. I told him I understand how tough it is to be a kid today. Everybody's wearing designer clothing and expensive sneakers. Grills for your teeth cost real change, you know. And you've got to have some cash if you want to hang out with your buds. Yup. Then you work at projecting the blame to somebody else. If he had a partner, I'd make it seem like it was all the other guy's doing. He was in this alone, so I talked about how rich people need to be more careful, you know? A house full of electronics and jewelry without a fence or burglar alarm or guard dog is just asking to be robbed. I scratched behind Rochester's ears. Are you a guard dog, boy? They say a golden retriever is so friendly to everybody he'll hold a burglar's flashlight in his mouth. Not that one, Rick said, nodding towards Rochester. I've seen him defend you. I remembered Rochester doing just that and snuggled his big golden body up against mine on the bench. Then I minimized what the suspect did, Rick continued. You know, it's not a big deal, just some small break-ins. I told him, it's not like you killed anybody, right? You don't tape these interviews, do you? Because I can just imagine what it would sound like to have a cop say that at a trial. No tape. It's all about establishing a rapport with the suspect. He goes to Pennsbury High, so I started talking to him about high school, what it was like when we were kids, what it's like now, that kind of thing. Then I got him to admit to being near the scene, and eventually to having some of the stuff that was stolen. He drank some beer. You have to be careful not to be coercive. You can't threaten him or anybody else, and a cop can't promise to go easy on him because it's not the cops who file the charges and prosecute the case, it's the DA. What's going to happen to this kid? He's up at the youth center in Doylestown right now. It's up to the DA if he stays there or moves on to a state prison. I don't think he's a bad kid, just not cut out for school, and he doesn't know what else to do but get into trouble. I thought about the kids I'd been teaching at Eastern as I fed another nacho chip to Rochester. A lot of them were in college just because their parents sent them, hoping that in 4 years they'd get some direction. Most did, but some didn't. And then I remembered Thomas Taylor, who had been denied admission to Eastern and whose life had gone off the rails afterward. Rick drained the last of the beer in his glass and looked toward the empty pitcher. Another? He asked. What the hell? I'd gone off the rails myself for a while, and though I felt like I was getting my act together again, I knew how tenuous the boundary was between being a solid citizen and ending up on the other side of an interrogation like Rick's. Can't get in trouble with a cop right here, right? Don't count on it, Rick said, and raised the empty pitcher toward the waitress. Chapter 11. Weekend Reflections. Saturday morning was cold and overcast. I woke early and mobilized for some much-needed house maintenance, which included mopping the kitchen floor and vacuuming the living room. I had never been much of a housekeeper. It was one of Mary's biggest complaints about me when we were married. I just didn't see things she did, the tiny specks on the kitchen counter, the mold in the shower. But with Rochester, I couldn't help seeing the spots on the tile floor or the fine golden hairs that piled up in the corners. I couldn't count on Mary to vacuum or dust, and I couldn't afford a maid, so I had to clean up after myself in Rochester. Mary would have been so proud. Or not. The last I heard from her, she had remarried, a business executive even more successful than she was, and she had achieved her fondest wish. She had given birth to a child. The thing is, that had been my wish too, for us to have a child. But that wasn't to be, and I had Rochester instead. At 43, I thought I might marry again, but I doubted I would have children. Thinking of Mary made me melancholy, and the mindless work of cleaning the house gave my brain free rein to reconsider my past. Though I knew I shouldn't, I opened up my laptop after I finished vacuuming and Googled Mary Levitan. Mary had taken my last name when we were married. Her own was long and Polish and had too few vowels. As far as I knew, she'd kept Levitan after her new marriage, though I couldn't imagine why. I got over 450 results, including her accounts on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and MySpace. Rochester came over to where I sat at the kitchen table and nuzzled my leg, but I pushed him away. I clicked on Mary's Facebook page and read, "People who aren't friends with Mary see only some of her profile information. If you know Mary personally, send her a message or add her as a friend." I recognized her profile picture. It was one I had taken nearly 3 years before, when we discovered she was pregnant for the second time. Her blonde curls spilled around her face, which glowed like a Renaissance Madonna. Why was she using that picture, I wondered. Did she think of me when she saw it, or did she remember our unborn daughter? We had been thinking of names the day Mary miscarried. I liked Melissa, while Mary preferred Rachel. Melissa Levitan, Rachel Levitan, Rachel Melissa Levitan. Rochester nudged me more insistently and barked once. I know, I said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. I shouldn't be doing this. I have a new life. I have a job and friends, and you. I need to put the past behind me, right? He shook his head once, and his tongue lolled out of his mouth. I shut down the laptop and went back to dusting my books. Old books and new books, poetry, novels, short story collections, and nonfiction. Old textbooks and dictionaries and dozens of reference books, like rhyming dictionaries and lists of Greek and Latin word roots and anthologies of deathless prose. The books spilled over the bookcases and piled up on the floor in every place I lived. When Mary sold our house in Silicon Valley, while I was in prison, she had stored them all in a storage unit. I paid a king's ransom to have them shipped to Pennsylvania, and it took me a couple of months in the townhouse before I had them all unpacked. Rochester and I went for a long walk Saturday afternoon, just as dusk was falling. It was cold but not windy, and we walked through River Bend and down to the Delaware River. The cars on River Road had their headlights on, all of them going somewhere, maybe up to New Hope for dinner, or out to the movies, or just to hang out with friends. I wondered if I'd ever get my life together enough to start dating again, maybe meet a woman to marry. I could feel like I was getting there. Having this full-time job at Eastern was a good start. I didn't see how Mary had been able to jump so quickly into a new marriage after ours fell apart. Had she been planning to divorce me for a long time before my incarceration accelerated her plans? I hadn't been exactly happy with her, but I hadn't been thinking of divorce either. Rochester tugged on his leash. "You want to go home, boy?" I asked. "Want your bowl food?" In response, he tugged again, and we walked home in the gathering dark. After dinner, I turned on a dog show on the TV in my bedroom, and Rochester hopped up to join me, curling up against the pillow next to me. "Hey, give me some room," I said, pushing against his golden flank. "This is my bed, after all." He didn't budge, so I scooted over. I tried to get him to pay attention to the golden retriever when the sporting group came up for judging, but he preferred to snooze. The story of my life at that point, my only Saturday night companion, a dozy dog. Sunday morning I tried to sleep in, but Rochester came up to my bed and breathed in my face. When I covered my head with a blanket, he put his paws up on the side of the bed and nudged me. "Fine, you want to go out. We'll go. But it's going to be a short walk because we're hiking this afternoon." I dressed for the weather in long johns, jeans, heavy socks, and boots, and a long-sleeved t-shirt with the Eastern logo on it. On top of that, I layered a sweater, a scarf, sheepskin-lined leather gloves, a down parka, and a woolly hat. Rochester wore his fur coat as usual. The morning was crisp and bright, though bitter cold. We did a quick circuit around the neighborhood so Rochester could do his business and then hurried home. I swear it took me longer to dress than it did for us to walk. I carb-loaded, wolfing down chocolate chip pancakes, and then sprawled on the sofa reading the paper and doing the New York Times crossword puzzle. Just before noon, Rick pulled up in my driveway and beeped the horn of his truck. Rochester went wild. I called Rick's cell as I scrambled for my clothes. "Why doesn't the gate ever call me to tell me you're here?" "I'm the police, dude. I just flashed the badge." "Well, I need a couple of minutes to put on my layers, dude. I'm sending Rochester out." I opened the front door as I was pulling on my sweater, and Rochester rushed outside. Rick was standing by the back of the truck with the gate down, and Rascal was peeing on my rose bush. I closed the door and left them to their frolic while I finished dressing. By the time I climbed into Rick's truck, the dogs were curled up in the back, nestled into a couple of old comforters. "I know you grew up here," Rick said. "I was there, so how come you need so many layers?" He was wearing a heavy wool pea coat over a plaid shirt and a pair of jeans. No scarf, no gloves, no hat. You lose as much as 50% of your body heat through your head, you know, I said. Wimp. Moron. Speaking of morons, I had a date with Kelly Kazakis last night. She must be dumb to go out with you. He shook his head. I think all her brain power goes to staying upright with those big hooters threatening to tip her over, he said. She's not much for conversation, but she's sure fun in bed. Too bad she doesn't have a sister. I could use some of that kind of fun myself. Then go on a date, dimwit. Aren't there any eligible females at the college over the age of consent? They're all either teenagers or ready for the graveyard, I said. I do work with this one girl, Sally, but she's only 25. Do you realize I was entering college the year she was born? Made me feel like a dinosaur. The year we were both born. Rick pulled into the parking lot for Bowman's Hill Nature Preserve, and we let the dogs out of the back. They jumped down and raced around, chasing each other to see who could be the first to pee on something. Only a couple of other cars were in the lot, and it looked like everyone else was at the nature center. We threaded our way up the winding road that climbed up to the top of the hill, the dogs circling around us, racing ahead and then coming back. Most of the snow was gone, just a few hollows between trees and the occasional covering at the top of a pine tree, like a misplaced Christmas decoration. When Rick and I were kids, we used to come up to the park and the tower on school field trips. Back then, we believed that the tower had been used by George Washington's troops as a lookout post. But as an adult, I learned it had been built during the Depression to commemorate Washington's trip across the Delaware at Washington's Crossing, just below us. I'm worried that Tony Rinaldi is going off in the wrong direction suspecting Nora Leadham, I said when we were about halfway up the trail. I held up one gloved hand. Despite what you think about ex-wives, I just don't see her killing somebody. She's a poet, for Christ's sake. Ezra Pound, Rick said. Poet, traitor, locked up for years. God save me from a cop who knows literature. You have a reason why you don't think she did it, beyond her being a poet and all? It seems like she still loved him. And nobody ever kills somebody they love. And she's smart, I said, ignoring his wisecrack. Why take so many risks and kill him at the launch party? She could have gotten to him in so many other ways. I think it had to be somebody who didn't normally have a reason to associate with Joe. Or it could be somebody from the college, Rick said. People are always saying how professors get really vicious. They make cutting comments at faculty meetings, not cut throats. By the time we climbed all the way up to the tower, the dogs were tired. They curled up together at the edge of the fieldstone tower. You want to climb up? Rick said. Elevator, I said. We've still got to walk all the way back down to the truck. When we were on field trips, the school buses would pull up right at the tower, and all the kids would pile out. The building had no elevator back then, so we'd climb the curving staircase, peering out through the slits in the walls, then crowd into the observation deck at the top. Now there was an elevator, which my aching feet were happy to take advantage of. We stepped out onto the deck, and the vista was magnificent. We could see all the way to Trenton to the south, the Lambertville and Route 202 bridges to the north. So much of this land is just like it was when Washington came through here, Rick said. Makes you think, doesn't it? I nodded. You think people back then had the same problems we have today? Can't see George complaining to Martha about the way she's been looking at Tom Jefferson, Rick said. Or John Adams telling John Quincy to stay off the Xbox and get some exercise. But people have been jealous as long as they've been human. They've been stealing stuff and hurting other people and committing rape and murder and everything else the commandments told us not to. Spoken like a cop, I said. We are who we are. Walking down the curving staircase, peering occasionally through the slit windows at the green, brown, and occasionally white landscape of the park, I wondered about that. Was I doomed to be who I was for the rest of my life? And was that a good thing or a bad thing? The dogs jumped up when we emerged from the tower, welcoming us as if we'd been gone for years. They raced around in circles, jumped on us, barked and rolled around in the patches of snow just beyond the tower. I had the urge to join them, lying on my back and making a snow angel. But my grown-up self knew the consequences. I'd get snow down my back, get my pants wet, probably catch a cold. So I just clapped my hands and pointed toward the open back of Rick's truck and called my dog to me. Chapter 12. An Offer He Can't Refuse. Monday morning, the campus was crowded once again as students returned from winter break, scurried from dorms to classes. I ran into President Babson as Rochester and I were walking into Fields Hall. "I want to see everything that's been printed about Joe's death," Babson said. "Put a file together for me to read. Get it to me by the end of the day." I had just walked into my office when Rinaldi called. "Thanks for the tip on that guy who kept sending the letters to Eastern. We found him yesterday and brought him in for questioning. He really had it in for Degorian and the college. He hasn't admitted to the killing, but he has no alibi. We're going to keep working on him, and we've cleared Nora Leadham," he said. "Thought you'd want to know." "That's great, but where does that leave you?" "We talked to Bob Moran yesterday afternoon. He admits to being outside arguing with Degorian. Says he went up to the man just as Mrs. Leadham was leaving, so that puts her in the clear." "Is Moran your suspect now?" "Can't say. Right now we're still investigating." "Well, thanks for letting me know about Nora. Enjoy the rest of your day." "Easy for you to say," he said. That was good news. I sent a quick email to the president and to Mike, though I cautioned that we would have to wait for an official statement from the police before we could comment to the press. With the weight of Joe's murder off my mind, I began to look through a folder of newspaper and magazine clippings Dijon had assembled for me. Publications being what they are, it often takes months to assemble a complete file, but I read through the articles I had and Xeroxed copies for Babson. The murder always made the headlines, and the first several paragraphs of each story read like a medical examiner's report. But in almost every case, the article continued with a brief summary of Eastern's history, culled from the press kit I had prepared. The details of the campaign followed, and the overall exposure for the college and the campaign was greater than I could have hoped for. I went down to President Babson's office just before noon to give him my preliminary report. "You've done a good job, Steve," Babson said. "Without your groundwork, there would have been no benefit to Eastern. I'll look these over. Thank you." As I walked back to my office, the phone was ringing. "Steve, I'm glad I reached you. It's Lucas Roosevelt." Lucas was the chair of the English department. I would be forever grateful to him for hiring me as an adjunct instructor when I returned to Bucks County, and no one else was willing to take the chance on hiring a paroled felon. "What's up, Lucas? Did you have a good winter break?" "I did, but one of our adjuncts didn't. Perpetua Kaufman. Did you ever meet her?" "I'm sure I'd remember her if I did. Her name makes her sound like a Jewish nun." "You wouldn't be far from the mark," he said. "She was a nun a long time ago. Then she left the convent, taught English in El Salvador, and married a psychiatrist who was working for a human rights organization. I don't remember which one, but I'm sure I used to know." Lucas had a tendency to ramble from topic to topic. Behind his back, his students called him the Wandering Jew. I looked at the pile of papers on my desk as Lucas continued to witter on about Perpetua Kaufman. "Sorry, Lucas, but do you have a point?" I finally asked. "Oh dear, I've done it again. Lost my train of thought. Poor Perpetua. Had a faulty space heater and died of carbon monoxide poisoning over the winter break." "And you want me to—" I paused. "Write a biography of her or something?" "Oh no, I was hoping you could take over one of her classes. She was teaching professional and technical writing on Mondays and Wednesdays at 3. "I'm working full-time in the Alumni Relations office, Lucas. I don't think I can get away." "I already cleared it with John William Babson," Lucas said. "You'd be doing me, the English department, and Eastern College a great favor if you could pick this class up." "When you put it that way," I didn't bother to finish by saying, "I can't exactly refuse, but that's what I was thinking." "Excellent. Candace has the text and a copy of the syllabus for you," he said, referring to the department secretary, the perpetually sour Candace, "Don't call me Candy," Kane. "Mustache. Thanks ever so." He hung up before I could protest. I shrugged, pulled on my coat, and walked over to Blair Hall, the home of the English department. I found Candace at her desk, surrounded by spider plants and clay pots. She's a Wiccan whose love for the natural world exceeds any tiny bit of affection she might harbor for humans. She was a slim blonde in her 40s, wearing an incongruous pink sweater with a smiling snowman on it. "Here's the book," she said, handing me a spiral-bound handbook. And the syllabus, the course roster, and a copy of our department policies regarding adjunct staff. Fill out pages 1 through 25 and include copies of your undergraduate and graduate transcripts. You'll have to go online and take the sexual harassment tutorial, register for a staff ID card, and go to the campus safety department for a temporary parking permit. Candace, I taught here all last year. I've already done all this. She looked up at me. It was like I'd said I was from the planet Altarisha and my people taught using fish skins and wooden dice. Oh, she said. I looked at the syllabus. This class meets today? She took back all the paperwork except the syllabus and the roster. You won't be needing any of this then, she said. Candace, today? If that's what the syllabus says. Her phone rang and she answered. It was obvious from her body language that I was dismissed. I walked back across the quad to Fields Hall, sticking to the well-trod if somewhat slushy paths. A few dirty piles of old snow nestled around the bases of the pine trees in dirty clumps. Stapled flyers fluttered from the notice boards in the center of the quad as I walked past. I hadn't taught professional and technical writing for years, since I was a newly minted M.A. in New York, scrabbling for any work that came my way. But I'd been writing memos, letters, resumes, reports, and presentations for years. The syllabus was pretty straightforward. The class met in one of the computer-equipped classrooms in Blair Hall, and students did both in-class and online work, using a software program I had begun using in the previous term. I logged in and looked at the materials Perpetua had assembled, ignoring the messy pile of papers and phone messages on my desk. Fortunately, she had prepared a series of video lectures on each topic. I was surprised to see how old she was. She looked like she'd been a nun when Martin Luther was posting his 95 theses on that church door in Wittenberg. I didn't understand how someone could look so old, frail, and munchkin-like and still be alive. But then again, she wasn't anymore. I grabbed a hoagie from one of the trucks for lunch and went back to my regular work. I pulled bits of roast beef out of my sandwich and fed them to Rochester as I made phone calls and answered email. Just before 2, Dijon came in for her work-study shift. I'm rethinking this whole pre-med thing, she said, dropping a couple of huge texts on the reception desk outside my office. Do you believe how much reading we have to do for organic chemistry? When was the last time you saw a doctor, Dijon? She cocked her blonde head the way Rochester did when I said something to him that he didn't understand. But she said, I still go to my pediatrician back home. I guess it was like in August, just before I came back to campus. And wouldn't you want him to know everything about whatever might be wrong with you? Well, sure. Don't you think he had to study organic chemistry and understand everything? He's like 100 years old, she said. And he has a hunchback. Probably from carrying around heavy textbooks, I said. You have to accept the responsibility that comes with whatever career you choose, Dijon. You want to be a doctor? You have to be the absolute best doctor you can be, because people will depend on you to heal them or keep them healthy. But it's so hard. If it wasn't hard, then anybody could be a doctor. Would you want a doctor to treat you or your family who didn't have the brains and the determination to study organic chemistry? Fine, she said. But just for the record, I hate alkyl halides. I didn't even know what those were, but I said, duly noted. Then I walked back to Blair Hall. Time to be a teacher again. Chapter 13. Style and Grace in a Small Town. The professional and technical writing class met in a first-floor computer lab in an addition at the back of Blair Hall that hadn't been there when I was a student. The rest of the building was dark and gloomy, with tall Gothic arched windows in the classrooms and dusty fluorescent lights hung on pendants. The classrooms had rich wooden wainscoting and scuffed floors, and I had fond memories of seminars in the small rooms on the third floor. A professor and a handful of students discussing the meaning of life and literature. At least that's the way I remember it. We were probably as uncommunicative as today's students, and our professors must have felt like brain surgeons, probing our heads for any spark of intelligence. Tall windows in the computer classroom looked out on a walkway between buildings, where the grass was sparse and brown. A squirrel shook the branches of a pine tree as I walked into the room, causing a flurry of the last fine snow outside the window. Computers lined the perimeter of the room. About 20 students either sat at the terminals or at a couple of round tables in the middle of the room. I threaded my way through them saying, "Good afternoon," until I reached the podium. "You're not Sister Perpetua," a boy at one of the round tables said. "That's very perceptive," I said. "I'm Professor Steve Levitan, and I've been asked to take over your class for the rest of the term." "What happened to the sister?" a girl asked from the side of the room. "She was called to her heavenly reward last Thursday night. I see from her syllabus that we're discussing memos today. I'm going to give you a brief lecture on memos, and then I'm going to ask you to write a memo for distribution to the campus about Professor Kaufman and her death." "Will we have to use the phrase heavenly reward in the memo?" the same snarky boy at the table asked. "If it's appropriate for your audience." I used that as a segue into the topic of memos, forestalling any more comments. I told them how long I'd been teaching at Eastern and about my current job in the alumni office. "I write this kind of material for a living these days," I said, "and those of you who see yourselves earning a living at some point in the distant future will need to know how to communicate with your colleagues, your clients, and any other audience as appropriate." I pulled up Perpetua Kaufman's video lecture on memos. She was surprisingly animated for such an elderly, gnome-like person, and I was sorry that I hadn't had a chance to get to know her over the past year. But adjuncts tend to come and go as classes demand, and we don't spend a lot of time socializing with each other or with full-time faculty. When the video was finished, I said, "Now, I want you to consider the audience for your memo. Are you writing to your fellow students? To the faculty and administration? How do you think your memo might be different based on those different audiences?" The snarky kid raised his hand. "What's your name?" I asked. "Loosey-goosey. You could change the kind of language you use. More colloquial for students, more formal for adults." "I'm not sure all the faculty here behave like adults," I said. "But that's a good point. Any other ideas?" No one else had anything to say, so I started picking names off the roster, starting with one I recognized, the girl from the booster club who had helped at the party. "Barbara Seville?" "Professor Kaufman had a really interesting life. You could pick out different details to tell about her depending on the audience." "Good point. Where could you find information on Professor Kaufman for your memo?" I looked back at my roster. "Yenny?" I expected a girl, but a skinny boy with a wild bush of dark hair raised his hand. "Google?" "Yes, but Google's just a search engine. It just points you to sources. What kind of source would have the information you need?" "An obituary?" Lou asked. "Good idea. You can find obituaries by checking the local papers. What about something closer to home?" "La Rose?" I asked. A black girl with elaborate braids raised her hand. "Maybe on the Eastern website?" "Yep, there's often information about your professors on the site." I called the rest of the roll, then showed them where to find the memo templates in Microsoft Word. "You have the rest of the class to write this memo. Use the assignment button to submit." As they worked, I went up to the teaching station and used the computer to log into my email. I managed to answer a couple of press queries before Lou raised his hand and asked, "Professor?" "Yup." "If I finish the assignment, can I use the computer to work on something else? Sister Perpetua always let us." "I don't have a problem with that." I went back to my emails, and a few minutes before the end of class, I walked around the room, looking over shoulders. "You don't need the CC field if you're not copying anyone on the memo," I told La Rose. "You don't have to put a salutation on a memo," I told Ashleen. As I passed Lou's computer, I saw that he was working on a paper for history class that had someone else's name on the top. "That your paper?" I asked. "I'm just proofing for a friend." He minimized the paper quickly. It looked more like he was writing it for a friend, but I wasn't going to start my first day by accusing a stranger of plagiarism. I went back up to the podium. "Remember, guys, I will be grading you based on the format of your memo, as well as your ability to write clearly and punctuate appropriately." They all began packing up. Lou was the last to go, typing away up until his last classmate had left and I was standing by the door. "I'm going to lock the door," I said. "You can stay here until the next class comes in." "Thanks, Prof," he said, still clacking away at the keyboard. Eastern was to close at 4 o'clock that afternoon so we could all attend Joe DeGorian's funeral at St. Augustine's in Layville, and I got back to my office just in time to say hi to Rochester and give him a rawhide bone until I returned from the funeral. I didn't want to contemplate what kind of mischief he might get up to at a cemetery. I rode out to St. Augustine's with Sally Marston, and we slipped into a pew in front of Mike McCormick and Sam Boney, the director of intercollegiate athletics. Sam looked like a California beach boy sprung to life from the pages of a fashion catalog. He had been a collegiate swimmer and water polo champ at a California college, and he had maintained a swimmer's lean and muscular physique. He also had wheat blonde hair, blue eyes, and cheekbones models die for. A few rows back, I saw Nora's colleagues from the English department, and other departments were grouped around us. The priest concluded his eulogy by saying, "Someone told me that Joe managed a difficult process with style and grace, and that he managed to convey to the students who weren't admitted that it was in their best interest to forget about Eastern and move on to a better place for them. Today, we bid farewell to Joe as he heads to his own better place." The cemetery was behind the church, and we followed the pallbearers and the coffin down a paved path, and then across to the plot that had been reserved for Joe. A wind came up as we stood around the hillside grave, and the priest read a few words. I could feel that chill January wind sweeping across the Pennsylvania countryside and raising our fuel bills as we shivered in it. While the others stood and mingled for a few minutes after the coffin had been lowered into the earth, I walked to the top of the rise and looked out on the countryside. Before me, just beyond a checkerboard of farmland, lay Layville, its black roofs clustered together as if for warmth. Below my feet, blades of grass poked up through a thin slush, while along the roads it had turned a brown-gray from the exhaust of passing cars, and on the far hills it still looked deep and white. As I stared out at the roofs of Eastern College, I thought about how much the college had changed since it was founded, about all the Joe DeGorians and the Steve Levitans who must have worked there over the years, whose names and records were lost to history. What we remember of history is usually the movers and shakers, the people who change things. The Joe DeGorians merely maintain the status quo. I rode back to Eastern with Sally, picked up Rochester, and headed downriver. Night was just falling, neons awakening and cars just beginning to turn on their headlights. One of the things I had to adjust to when I came back to Bucks County, after the bright halogens of Silicon Valley, was the lack of streetlights. Where I lived with Mary, the night was almost as bright as the day, between the streetlights, store window lights, neon signs, and headlights. But in the country, when it was dark, it was dark. Most nights I found the dark welcoming, a soft gloom that overtook the day and gave us time to recharge. But since Joe died, I had started to fear the night because it covered the evil around us. I shivered, and Rochester snuggled next to me. As I fixed dinner, I kept one eye on the evening news and saw Thomas Taylor being led into the police station. "That's the homeless guy who was hanging around the car when we went to the printers," I said to Rochester. "I wonder if he picked up one of the programs from my car. Oh my God, maybe it was because of me that he knew where he could find Joe." I had to sit down, and Rochester came over to press his head against my knee. My mind was full of questions about the contact between Taylor and Joe. Had Taylor been hovering around outside Fields Hall and taken advantage of Joe's trip outside? Or had he contacted Joe and made arrangements to meet him outside? And would Taylor have even known about the party if it wasn't for me? Chapter 14. Living in Fear. I couldn't concentrate for the rest of the evening. I wanted to call Tony Rinaldi and ask what he'd learned from Taylor, but I knew it wasn't my business. I played endless games of computer solitaire, Scrabble, and Mahjong, and finally took a sleeping pill around 11, after taking Rochester out for a quick pee. The next morning I woke early and heard the slap of the Courier Times on the driveway. I yawned, climbed out of bed, and dressed for dog walking. On my way down the driveway, Rochester pulling me like he was the lead engine on a freight train, I picked up the paper and pulled it out of its plastic wrapper. As I followed Rochester down the street, I unfolded it and the headline jumped out at me. "Is Eastern College safe?" it read. "Campus murder has students living in fear." Pascal Montrouge, who I had pegged as a sleazeball the first time I met him, had interviewed students, faculty, and staff members and recorded their fears that lax security had led to Joe's murder. "I can't sleep at night," one girl was quoted as saying. My roommate and I take turns taking naps during the day. He hadn't come to me for my take on the situation, which I resented. He pointed out that a homeless man had been detained in connection with the murders, which further spurred questions about campus security. He made it seem like homeless people were camped all around the college grounds. Montrouge didn't mention Taylor's connection with the college or any possible motive, which I thought was a serious omission. If Taylor was the killer, then Joe's murder hadn't been a random act that should sow fear throughout the college. My anger simmered as Rochester and I drove up the river road to Layville. The weather was warming up, and the sun had melted most of the snow in the fields and farmyards. The campus was almost completely snow-free. I picked up a copy of the Eastern Daily Sun, the campus newspaper, in the lobby of Fields Hall on my way to my office. The front page featured a story about campus security, and I stopped at the foot of the curving staircase to read it. An unnamed source in the campus security office claimed that the incidence of crime on the campus had risen nearly 50% in the past year. There had been more muggings, burglaries, and violent assaults in the last year than in the previous 3. Our director of security had declined to comment on the story, which unfortunately lent credence to the report. As I walked into my office, Babson's secretary buzzed me with a summons. "I presume you've seen the morning paper," he said when I walked into his office. Mike was sitting in the visitor chair next to Babson's desk. "Good morning, President Babson." "Morning, Mike. Yes, I read the article in the Courier-Times, and then the one in the Daily Sun. Is it true? We've upped our security patrols?" "Do we have any choice?" he asked. "I think Eastern College is as safe as any other campus in the United States, but we have to do something to reassure people." I sat down next to Mike, and the three of us discussed strategies for replying to press queries about security. Babson was worried that if the story continued much longer, it could have a negative impact on everything we did. "Sally says that admissions is getting questions," he said, "and I've already heard from 3 alumni parents this morning. We don't want this to develop into some kind of mob mentality, students transferring, declining our offers of admission. Then the faculty start to leave and donations tank. We've got to catch this, Steve, or we could find ourselves on a downward spiral we can't stop." "I don't understand why the police haven't released the fact that Thomas Taylor had a personal motive," I said. "That should make things easier for us, that he's not just some random homicidal homeless man. I'm going to call Sergeant Rinaldi and check in with him, and then I'll start working the phones." "Protecting Eastern's reputation is job 1 right now," Babson said. "Let me know if you need me or my office to do anything." When I returned to my office, Montrouge finally called for my statement. I wanted to be petty and snub with him, but that would only make things worse. But all I could do was confirm that the incidence of burglary on campus is up, while assault and muggings had dropped dramatically. "But there's no relationship between these problems, which every campus has to some degree, and Joe's death." "I'm not so sure about that, Steve," he said. His French accent had become very irritating. I wanted to tell him that my name was not Stiv, but I refrained. "It was an isolated incident," I insisted. "You should talk to Sergeant Rinaldi at the Layville Police. See what he has to say about the suspect he has in custody." "He's not saying anything," Montrouge said. "So right now, all I have is the problems at the campus. I'm working on a follow-up story for tomorrow's paper." I struggled to get him to focus on the positives about Eastern, but as he pointed out, good news doesn't sell papers. As soon as I hung up with Montrouge, I called Tony Rinaldi. "Are you going to charge that homeless guy I saw on the news last night?" I asked. "Not yet. We're still checking his motive and his alibi." All through the morning, alumni called me, reporters called me, parents of current students called, and so did students and faculty members and even support staff from other offices. "Yes, it's safe to park in the faculty lot," I said. "No, we're not planning to give guns to our security guards. No, no one else has been murdered on campus." At 11:30, we all gathered in Babson's office, and he opened our staff meeting, as he usually did, with a 10-minute tirade about the inefficiency he had seen around the campus since we last had met. He paid a prodigious amount of attention to detail, out-of-date bulletin boards, scarcity of recruiting materials in the admissions office waiting room, overflowing trash bins outside the dorms, an untended leak in the lobby of the gym. He delivered yet another pile of Ivy League clippings to me, and a Stanford viewbook to Sally. Sam Bonny was cheerful and cool in giving his report, and maintained his equanimity, even when Babson railed about the ineptitude of the women's volleyball team. "The ball goes over the net," he yelled. "Not under it, not into it. Do they need someone to tell them that?" "They know, President Babson. Remember, they're playing for the fun of it, for the chance to compete. They do their best." I aimed for a friendly professionalism in my report. Even though Joe's murder was tragic and resulted in some unpleasant sensationalized publicity for Eastern, we've gotten a great deal of good publicity as well. Every article mentions the attractiveness of the campus, the academic strengths of the college, and the quality of the student body. "Murder trumps a pretty campus or a bunch of smart students, Steve," Babson said. "You've got to get these reporters to stop mentioning Joe's death or trying to link it to security issues here. That kind of news does us no good at all." "I won't let you down," I said. "See that you don't." He turned to Sally. "How are things going in your office?" "We've been swamped with calls and email," she said. "We're expecting a flood of late applicants that could potentially move our selectivity ratio up by several percentage points." "Even with the news of the murder?" he asked. She nodded. "Steve's right. Most people aren't paying attention to Joe's death or any potential safety issues. They're just seeing Eastern's name and reputation, and that seems to be spurring them to apply." Mike McCormick reported on the progress of the capital campaign. "Individual contributions are coming in more rapidly than we expected. Corporate and foundation support is also proving easier to obtain. It seems the publicity surrounding Eastern recently has made our name much more recognizable." Mike stood up and started to pace back and forth in front of the table. "Even with this early support, our alumni and friends will have to realize," he said, pounding the air with his fist as he talked, "that their support is essential to the success of this campaign and to Eastern's future. We have an elderly faculty, a decaying physical plant, and a declining applicant base. But we have a solid academic program and an excellent national reputation. And with enough money behind us, we can fix any leak, recruit any student, hire any professor. We can do what must be done to make Eastern number one." I stole a glance at Sally and had to smother a giggle. It was like seeing a younger Babson with a darker beard, but a Babson possessed with a vision of Eastern. "Just as much as any professor on this faculty, we're educators," Mike said. "We have to get the message across to our donors that Eastern needs their dollars. We need their support." In his fervor, he reminded me of those television evangelists whose passion rages through them like a fever. His face had gotten a little red, and his eyes positively glowed like one of the Ayatollah's henchmen who had just gunned down a Yankee imperialist in the name of the Holy Jihad. Babson grinned benevolently behind him. Though Babson had no children of his own, he had infected Mike with enough of his spirit and belief in Eastern to make him as close to a son as he could. Both he and Babson could be frightening. I was glad that reporters like Pascal Montrouge hadn't been exposed to their level of fanaticism. While it would make great copy to show the megalomania at the Eastern's head, it wouldn't be a good thing for my career in public relations. When Mike was finished, Babson banged his fist on the table. "I want you all to remember that this campaign is my legacy. Generations of students will remember my name. I'm depending on every one of you to make my vision come true." He stood up. "Meeting adjourned," he said as he turned and walked out. "And have a nice day," I said under my breath. Sally laughed. Chapter 15. A Nose for News. More phone calls came in when I got back to my office, with more questions about campus safety. Around 4 o'clock, Tony Rinaldi called. "I wanted to give you a heads up on some bad news," he said. "We got a partial print from the knife, and it doesn't match Thomas Taylor, or Nora Leadham for that matter, so it looks like he's in the clear." "What about Bob Moran?" I asked. "Didn't you say that he was out in the garden with Joe too?" "Yeah, but he's got an attorney and he's not talking." "Can you get his fingerprints?" "We can, but since he's not cooperating, it requires a subpoena, and I'm going to need a lot more evidence before I can ask for one. So far, I don't have anyone who witnessed them talking, and we don't have evidence that he made any threats toward DeGorian." I walked back down the hall to President Babson's office to pass the news on to him, but he had already left for a fundraising cocktail party in New York. I decided to wait until the morning to tell him. Back at my desk, I didn't have much appetite for work, so I gathered up my stuff, hooked up Rochester's leash, and closed my office. I shivered as Rochester and I walked back to my car, and not just from the cold or the bitter wind that had picked up. Layville was dangerous. Eastern College was dangerous. I spent an hour or so that evening grading the tech writing class's memos about the death of Perpetua Kaufman. I discovered that she had lived in Stewart's Crossing too, in a little house along the canal, between Main Street and the Delaware River. I remembered those houses, 12 of them in a row, all built to house canal workers back in the 1800s. When I was a kid, the residents used to decorate them all together as the 12 Days of Christmas. I wondered which house had been Perpetua's, the partridge in a pear tree, the 12 drummers drumming, or some anonymous number in between. My favorite as a teenager had been the 6 geese a-laying. My friends and I made a lot of snickering jokes about the geese getting laid. The next morning I read the Gazette and the Courier-Times at my desk. Both carried the story of Thomas Taylor's release. That combined with the news about security issues at Eastern to keep the story of Joe's murder going. Both papers were full of speculation about the case, wondering if someone on the faculty or staff was the murderer, and that perhaps Eastern College was a co-conspirator. I went down to the kitchen for coffee when I finished reading, and Rochester followed me, hoping one of the staff had left something edible at his level. Sally was sitting at the big oak table, wearing her usual Fair Isle sweater, this one with a big Go Eastern Young Student button just below the collar. She had papers spread out before her and a big mug of coffee at her side. "I had to get out of my office," she said. "Or Joe's office, really. The phone just doesn't stop ringing, and I have to pull together some statistics for Babson." Rochester put his paws up on the table and nosed at a piece of paper. "You can't eat that, Rochester," I said, tugging him back to the floor by his collar. "What kind of stats do you need?" I asked. "I did some statistical work in the past, mostly with databases." "An admissions office lives and dies on yield," she said. "That's the percentage of students who are offered admission who accept the offer. As the yield goes down, we have to accept more and more students to make a class, and the qualifications we consider get lower and lower." Rochester jumped back up to the table. His paw grabbed a piece of paper and tossed it to the floor. "Rochester, bad dog," I said, leaning down to pick up the paper. He nudged his head against my arm, and he tried to grab the page in his mouth as I got up. "What is it about this paper?" I asked. "Did someone spill some food on it?" I looked down. "This is the report Joe published last year. Wow, we got 3,500 applications last year. I didn't realize it was that many." 3,500? That's not right. Sally fiddled around with her papers. "Here's the number. It was 2,800. "That's a big gap," I said. "Let me see that report." I handed it to her and she scanned it. "It says here that our yield was a 1 in 7 ratio, but the real numbers show more like 1 in 5. I sat down across from her, and Rochester plopped on the floor behind my chair. "Are you sure?" "See for yourself." She passed a bunch of pages to me and turned the calculator so that it faced me. I started adding the numbers for the different categories of students. I added them twice, just to be sure. "You're right," I said. "Maybe when Joe put out this report, he just made a mistake." "These aren't mistakes. These are lies." She picked up her coffee mug, cradling it in one hand, but didn't drink. "With a 1 in 5 ratio, we're a lot lower than the Ivies or many of the other schools in our category. You know how keen Babson is on competing with Harvard and Yale." "Have you checked any of the other statistics we published last year?" I asked. "SAT scores and so on?" She shook her head. "I guess we should, though." We needed more information than she had in the kitchen, so Rochester and I followed her back to her office. He curled up in the corner near the heater while she and I sifted through documents and called up computer files. It was nearly lunchtime before we were finished. "This is scary," Sally said. "Joe pumped up our average SAT scores a few points and gave us a couple of national merit scholars who actually went somewhere else. He even inflated the percentage of minority students here. We're talking serious breach of ethics. And more important, we're talking serious problems with admissions that Joe wasn't admitting." "We're talking about a public relations nightmare, too," especially with both the press and the police nosing around. I don't know if Babson knows about it, and I'm afraid to be the one to tell him, Sally said. I heard a banging noise and looked up. Rochester had gotten up from his place by the heater and was nosing his head against the bottom drawer of Joe's file cabinet, which Sally had left open. "What's up, boy?" I asked, going over to him. "You have something else you want to point out to us?" He shook his head and snorted. There were still a couple of thin manila folders left in the drawer, and I pulled them out. "What are these?" I asked. "Joe's correspondence files. I haven't looked at them yet." I opened the first folder and started flipping through the pages. "Boring, boring, boring," I said. I went to the next, which was more of the same. Travel receipts, memos about various high schools and their college counselors. I didn't hit pay dirt until the last one. It was a memo Joe had written to Babson, hand-typed on Eastern memo paper. In it, Joe announced his retirement from Eastern. He said he was using that opportunity to admit that he had been fabricating statistics. "Wow," I said. "Something like that could destroy the campaign." "Do you think anyone else knew about it?" Sally asked. "Maybe Babson did. Maybe he killed Joe to cover this up." Like every expensive private liberal arts college, Eastern had some serious problems. Declining applicant pool, less federal scholarship aid, rising tuition, and our problems were worse than we thought. "Babson's a little crazy," I said. "But murder? No. Plus, he wouldn't have done anything to jeopardize the campaign." I handed the memo to her. "Look, we've got to keep this a secret for a while. Let the campaign get rolling. We'll figure out how to let the news out little by little." I went back to my office, got my coat and scarf, and took Rochester down the hill for a quick walk, and so that we could grab lunch from one of the trucks. I ordered Rochester a plain hamburger, no bun. When I got back to my office, I ate at my desk, feeding him bits of chopped beef between bites of my sandwich. I went back to Blair Hall at 2, taught the tech writing class about business letters, and worked at connecting their names to their faces. As usual in any class, a few kids stood out at first. Lou, the guy who was always working on papers, LaRose, the black girl with the elaborate hairdos, Barbara, the tiny blonde elf. Once again, I thought Yenny was a girl and was confused when a boy answered as I called the roll. The other kids blended together, but I hoped to get to know them all eventually. After class, I walked over to the gym for a brainstorming session with Sam Bonny. Athletic supporters, no pun intended, are among a college's most loyal and vocal fans. I was hoping that Sam would have some ideas about how we could reach out to them as part of the Capitol campaign. I found him up on a ladder in the new gym, peering above the acoustic ceiling tiles. "So that's where you find your athletic talent," I said. "No, this is where we find our leaky pipes. Under the job description for athletic director, you find responsible for maintenance of one new gym, poorly constructed, one old gym, seldom used, one aging field house, and one poorly equipped boathouse. Too far away to be practical." The new gym wasn't all that new, but Eastern's original gym, a high-ceilinged square with wooden floors, was still used for occasional events. The new gym, built in the 1970s, had been state-of-the-art when I was a student. "What's the matter with this gym?" I asked. "I always thought it was in terrific condition." "You were also in school here 25 years ago." I winced. "Don't remind me, but tell me what's wrong." He counted off on his fingers. "Poor planning, a shoddy construction, skimping on the quality of piping, inadequate ventilation. You want me to go on? I'd love to, but you're not supposed to speak ill of the dead. Our pal Joe awarded the contracts and supervised the construction of this place." "Joe DeGorian?" "One and the same, during that time when he was in charge of physical plant. Have you noticed we've already replaced that brick facing on the front of the building?" "I just thought it was general beautification." "Poor insulation. Water was seeping in through the mortar and cracking the walls. Heck of a job to fix it." "You think he just did a bad job?" I asked. "I think he let a lot of the contractors get away with murder. Either he didn't know what to look for or he deliberately looked the other way." "I can't believe Joe would do that to Eastern." "I can believe anything of anyone," Sam said, "especially if there is money involved. I'm not saying anything, mind you." He put his palms straight out in front of him. "But you get that idea when you live with these problems. And I always thought we had great facilities. How can we use this information to get donations to the Capitol campaign? Come into my office and I'll show you what I found." Sam was wearing a tight-fitting red alligator shirt, sweatpants, and high-top sneakers. He still had an athlete's physique, the kind I had only aspired to when I was in college. Years of running had given me good cardiovascular conditioning and a certain flexibility, but I had never managed the kind of tone Sam had. It didn't seem fair that he was smart, too, but he had graduated cum laude from Pepperdine and had an MA in physical education and an MBA in management from USC. Word around the campus had Sam aiming for a higher managerial role once the campaign was in full swing. On the way, we talked about the police progress on Joe's murder. Sally said you two were looking for some information for the police, that a lot of people had grudges against Joe. I looked at him. You talk to Sally often? He blushed a little. We're trying to keep it quiet. Eastern's a small place and news travels fast. Your secret's safe with me. When we got to his office, he pulled up a file on his computer and sent it to the printer. This is a list of my priorities. We need a new weight room with some state-of-the-art equipment. I'd love to have a physical therapist on staff to work on conditioning with athletes across sports. I can always use more money for athletic scholarships, and we need funds for general maintenance on all facilities. From what I know from Mike, the general funds are the hardest to get, I said. But I can help you put together some materials for the campaign to get specific donations, the weight room, the scholarships, and so on. Can you put together a list of students I could interview and photograph? And do you have any good video clips from games? I'm thinking of doing more with YouTube and other social networking sites. We made a list of everything we could do for each other, and I walked back to my office thinking about Sally dating Sam. I had to admit to being jealous. I liked Sally, and I had been thinking, way at the back of my mind, about asking her out, even though I was a lot older than she was. I had thought once about dating Gail, the bakery owner, but she was a lot younger than I was too. Was something keeping me from looking at available women? Or was I just not running into them, working on a college campus? Chapter 16. Joe's House. I was depressed as I walked back up to Fields Hall through the cold, wet chill of February. Suddenly, Eastern College had become a hotbed of news, all bad. It was as if we had stripped the pleasant, small-town collegiate veneer off the place and found something ugly and sordid underneath. When Horatio Wilcox, Eastern's founder, moved the college up the hill from its beginnings in a church in Layville, he took over both the Fields estate and the Fields fortune. He hired a firm of architects to create a campus for his new school. The collegiate Gothic style was flourishing in our vicinity at the University of Pennsylvania, and Bryn Mawr College and Wilcox wanted the same thing for his campus. The major new buildings were Wilcox Hall, to house the liberal arts and humanities, Pennsylvania Hall, which held classrooms and laboratories for the physics, chemistry, and mathematics departments, and President's Tower, a large granite bell tower. Dormitories and eventually fraternities followed, and then a new hall for the study of languages and the humanities in the 1940s. In the 1950s, Eastern built a new laboratory building, and then in the 1960s, the new gym. The campus, which had begun by dominating the top of the hill, as Fields had intended his mansion to do, began to spread over it. Long dormitories flanked the oval drive. Fraternities and sororities sat on either side of the gates, and new construction spread over the back side of the hill. Only the main lawn, within the arc of the driveway, remained untouched. It was shaded by old elms and provided a pleasant place to relax or study on warm afternoons. An old wrought iron fence protected it from the clamor of Main Street, which stretched away east to the center of Layville. Rounding a corner, I saw Tony Rinaldi ahead of me and called to him. "Just walking around," he said. "Sometimes I think if I just spend enough time up here, the answer will come to me." "Well, it's a college. We're supposed to provide an education." "And I wonder about that. What makes these kids come to Eastern, to Layville? My father came to work in the Fields factory. I was born here and never had much reason to leave. But you came here to go to school. What made you do it?" "Money," I said. "Eastern made me a better offer than any of the other schools in the Ivy League. See, those schools all signed the Ivy Financial Agreement, which stipulates that no student should have to decide between any of the signers on the basis of financial aid. Eastern routinely makes a practice of overguessing the Ivies and stealing away the middle-class ones who don't get a lot of financial aid elsewhere." "Makes for a pretty middle-class school, doesn't it?" Oh, we give a lot of scholarships to smart kids from poor families, and a certain number of rich kids come here for the academics or because it's small. Our one disadvantage is our location. Layville can't match the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Cambridge, New York, or Princeton. We walked along a path that had been cleared of slush, but a few little puddles remained. I walked carefully, but Rinaldi, in his shiny black boots, just plowed along. "So you came to Eastern in 1985, he said. "Why'd you leave?" "I went to graduate school at Columbia, and then got a job in the city, met my ex-wife, fell in love, got married. When she got the chance for a big job in California, we packed up and went. Never thought about coming back to Bucks County." Tony already knew about my time in prison. When I got out on parole, I didn't know where to go, but my father had just died and left me his townhouse, and it was easier to come back here than to start all over somewhere else. We reached the front door of Fields Hall, and Tony said, "Listen, Steve, I'm the first to admit it when I need some help, and right now my investigation is stalled. I cleared Nora Leadham and Thomas Taylor, and I can't find enough information on Bob Moran to get a subpoena. I spent the morning going through Mr. DeGorian's emails and phone records, and I didn't find anything I already knew." "I found some things, though," I said. "Come on inside and I'll fill you in." As we walked into my office, I told him about the problems Sam had found with the gym and the statistics Joe had been fudging and the resignation memo. "You think President Babson knew about these inaccurate statistics and the problems with the gym?" "You'd think if he did, he'd have fired Joe on the spot," I said. But Joe was still here. "Could someone else have known about it and be blackmailing DeGorian, this Zamboni guy?" "Samboni, not Zamboni. Why kill Joe if the blackmailer could get money out of him?" "DeGorian couldn't pay, or wouldn't," Tony said. "He was going to resign anyway. Maybe he threatened to take the blackmailer down with him." He sighed. "Every time I try to talk to somebody from this college, I get stonewalled. It's the old town and gown thing. And it's not the first time it's happened to me lately. We got a tip that students up here were selling steroids, but I haven't been able to dig any deeper than that." For as long as the college had been in existence, conflicts had simmered between it and the community. When I was in school at Eastern, Layville residents complained when the college wanted to build a new gym on previously open land, and the college administration fought against passage of an ordinance that would restrict what it could do with its property. Students got into trouble at bars and stores, and sometimes thought they were better than the locals. Occasionally there had been violence, and the break-in rate soared during the college vacations when students left valuables behind. "What can I do to help?" I asked. "I need more background on people who might have had a grudge against Joe DeGorian," he said. "It's my impression that this is an inside job, because of the circumstances. The killer had to be familiar with this building in order to know where Mr. DeGorian was going. He had to know about this event and that it would provide a good cover for him. We think he may have tried to hurt the college, too, by killing Mr. DeGorian at your party." "You think someone killed Joe just to hurt Eastern?" "He was killed because somebody wanted him dead. What I'd like you to do is just keep your ears and eyes open. Anything you hear, anything you see that you think might be important, if you could let me know. I know a college is a little world of its own, and you being in this world, you might catch something that an outsider wouldn't. You know, it's funny, but even though I've lived here in Layville all my life, I've never been very comfortable up here at the college. And this murder doesn't make me feel any more comfortable. No, sir, not at all." I looked at the clock and realized I was due in Blair Hall to teach tech writing. I hurried to class and played Perpetua Kaufman's video presentation on writing research papers. When the video was finished, I asked, "Who has an idea about a topic?" Dead silence. "Okay, let's talk about how to choose a topic. Let's say you're interested in the environment. That's a huge topic, so you have to narrow it down. Any ideas?" "Global warming?" Lou suggested. "Still a big topic. You could narrow it down to the shrinking of the polar ice cap or rising sea levels because big icebergs in the Arctic are melting." "Or hurricanes," LaRose said. "I read something how global warming leads to this El Niño thing, which makes more hurricanes." "You could write about an endangered species," Barbara said. "Like an animal or a plant." "Great. See how we're getting down to something that's manageable in a short paper? I want you all to spend some time brainstorming your topics, and then before the end of class, we'll go over them again." I sat down at my computer and answered emails, then walked around the room. Lucy Goosey was working on a long paper about academic responsibility. "You have made a lot of progress," I said, looking over his shoulder. "Oh, this is a paper for another class," he said. "I'm not sure what I'm going to write about here yet." "Well, you should be focusing on this class while you're here. If you finish what you have to do for me, then you can do your other work." "But this paper's due tomorrow," he said. "Please, Prof." "You give me a topic. I'll let you keep going on that." "How about that group Sister Perpetua belonged to?" he asked. "Bucks County Nature Conservatory? I was looking at their website and it looked really interesting. I could write about them." The name was vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. "What do they do?" "Local activism for environmental stuff. They volunteer as docents at parks, and they do surveys of wildlife and stuff." "Sounds good. That's an opportunity for primary research, too." I walked back up to the front of the room. "Listen up for a minute," I said. "Lou's idea lends itself to primary research. You all know the difference between primary and secondary research?" They looked like I had asked for the difference between air and water, something they should know, but couldn't quite put into words. "You do primary research when you go out and experience the world. You ask questions, look for things in the real world." "Like the police?" LaRose asked. "Kind of," I thought, thinking of Tony Rinaldi and the way he was investigating Joe DeGorian's murder. "You could write a questionnaire about attitudes toward smoking, or teenage sex, or abortion, and then compile the results. Or, in Lou's case, he could attend a meeting of the group he's interested in, maybe volunteer with them." "And what's the other?" Barbara asked. "Secondary research is the kind you guys usually do. You read books and magazine articles written about your subject, about the first-hand research other people have done." They went back to work, and by the end of our hour and a quarter, it looked like they were all on track to decent topics. The rest of the afternoon passed quickly. I ran into Nora and Sally in the lobby of Fields Hall as we were all leaving for the day. "I have to go over to Joe's house and pick up some things," Nora said. "I'm not looking forward to it." "Do you want us to come along with you?" Sally asked. "Steve and me?" Rochester barked once. "And Rochester, of course." "That would be so nice," Nora said. "It'll be the first time I've been there since, well, you know." Rochester hopped into the passenger seat of the BMW, and we followed Nora's SUV down the hill, with Sally behind us. We negotiated the suburban streets along the river to Joe's house. "You're going to have to be a good boy," I said to him. "No digging around in things that don't belong to you. You hear me?" He just sat with his head on his paws. Sometimes he's worse than a teenager. The three of us parked on the street in front of Joe's house. "I just keep going over that evening in my mind," Nora said as we all walked up to the front door. "I keep feeling I might have seen something or heard something important, but I just can't remember." "Run through once again what you did that night," I suggested. "Sometimes it helps to have someone else listen." Nora fished around in her shoulder bag for the key to Joe's front door, took a deep breath, and inserted it in the lock. The door swung open. The air inside was musty. We walked inside, and she turned up the heat and started turning on lights. "I was talking with Mike McCormick about John Babson. We were watching him move around the room. I saw Babson head toward the French doors, and I decided to go outside myself and have a cigarette." "So President Babson was outside too?" "I think so. I didn't see him. I was on the east side of the building where Joe was found." "Did you see anyone else outside?" Nora was quiet for a while. "I heard several of those young men from the Rising Suns. They were hiding outside behind the door that leads into the admissions hallway, laughing and talking. I smelled some marijuana smoke. I found a sheltered place between trees and pulled out my cigarettes. Joe was pacing around outside like he had something serious on his mind, but when he saw me, he lit into me again about smoking." "You shouldn't, you know," Sally said. "Sam shows his kids these slides of what their lungs look like after smoking. It's gruesome." "I know, dear. I heard enough of it from Joe." She walked into the kitchen and began rinsing the dirty dishes in the sink and stacking them in the dishwasher. "I told him that he ought to stay out of my business," Nora continued. "He started yelling about selling the land in New Hampshire, and that's when I told him he frustrated me so much sometimes I could kill him." "Which those women waiting to go inside overheard." She nodded. "I stubbed out my cigarette and went inside. I didn't see Joe again until they took him away." "So you didn't see Bob Moran. Apparently he saw you." "The electric car man? What in the world was he doing there?" "He's an Eastern alum. His son is applying for the fall class, and Joe wouldn't let him in. Really? Do you think he killed Joe? Rinaldi says he doesn't have enough evidence to subpoena Moran's fingerprints, I said, but he's looking into him. Nora straightened up. I need to find the deed for the land. Joe's interest becomes part of his estate and the attorney needs it. Will you be okay out here for a few minutes? Sure, Sally said. I walked over to Joe's bookcase and started browsing, while Sally sent someone, probably Sam Bonny, a text message. As Nora had once said, Joe wasn't much for literature. Most of the books on the shelf were nonfiction, many of them about sports. I picked up a copy of the Farmer's Almanac and was paging through it when I realized Rochester was pawing at a pile of papers on the bottom shelf. They slid forward onto the ground. I said, "Oh, Rochester, what are you doing?" He looked up at me with a doggy grin, like he was expecting a treat for messing up Joe's house. I sat down on the floor and started putting the papers back in order, Rochester's head in my lap, nosing at everything. "This is getting old, Rochester," I said. "I wish you could talk so you could just tell me what you want me to know." He barked once. "He agrees with you," Sally said, looking up from her phone. "You need a hand down there?" "Sure." The papers had slid everywhere. Most of them were copies of correspondence. It didn't look like Joe had much of a filing system. Insurance claims were next to newspaper clippings, which were next to doctor's reports. "This is weird," Sally said, holding up one piece of paper. "Weird how?" "This is a copy of a student's application essay and portfolio from last year." "Why would Joe have that at home?" "That's a good question." I looked over at it. The student was Barbara Seville, who was in my tech writing class, and it included a series of nature photographs she had taken. "Put it aside," I said. "We can take it back to the college and see if it relates to anything." Rochester kept nosing at the papers, and I kept pushing him away. After a while, Nora came out of the bedroom with the paperwork she had come for, and she sat down on the floor with us and kept looking. "He was such a pack rat," she said. "Look at this. I remember when we went on this trip, a couple of years after we were married." She held up the brochure for a small inn in Vermont. "Why in the world would he have kept this?" "Maybe he had a good time," Sally said. We ended up putting together a whole folder of questionable documents to look over ourselves and possibly pass on to Tony Rinaldi. We parted company then, and Rochester and I drove home.